Blood streaked through white snow as Eleanor Vale stood barefoot in a blizzard, staring down three armed men who'd just cracked her husband's skull open with a rifle butt. The town called her worthless, unmarriageable, a burden sold off to a monster in the mountains. But tonight, that unwanted daughter would discover exactly what she was made of. This is the story of a woman everyone underestimated, a forced marriage that became something nobody expected, and the moment courage mattered more than beauty ever could. Stay with me until the end, hit that like button, and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far this story travels. Now, let me take you to Black Hollow Ridge, where everything began. The first time Eleanor Vale understood what she was worth, she was standing in her father's barn, listening to him negotiate her price. She was 28 years old, and the number kept dropping. "She's strong," her father said, desperation making his voice crack. "Good with animals, knows her letters and numbers, can cook, clean, mend. I've seen her." Gideon Crow's voice cut through the cold barn air like wind through broken boards. "Don't need the livestock auction." Eleanor stood in the shadows by the horse stalls, her work-roughened hands gripping a feed bucket so hard her knuckles went white. She'd known this was coming, had known for 3 weeks, ever since the bank notice arrived and her father started looking at her differently. Not like a daughter, like an asset he could liquidate. "The debt's $4,700, her father continued, ignoring the interruption, ignoring Eleanor entirely. "You clear it, she's yours. Legal marriage, proper certificate, the whole—" "I know what a marriage is." Eleanor finally looked at the man who was apparently buying her like a plow horse. Gideon Crow stood near the barn entrance, backlit by weak February sunlight that did nothing to warm the space. He was tall, taller than seemed reasonable, with shoulders that strained against a canvas coat that had seen better decades. His face was all hard angles and weathered skin, crossed by a scar that ran from his left temple down to his jaw. Dark hair, graying at the temples, eyes the color of storm clouds. He looked exactly like what the town said he was. A killer who'd learned his trade in the war and never quite figured out how to stop. "So we got a deal?" Her father's voice pitched higher, eager, pathetic. Gideon's eyes shifted to Eleanor for the first time. She met his gaze and refused to look away, even though her heart hammered against her ribs. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her afraid. Wouldn't give anyone that satisfaction ever again. Something flickered across his face, too quick to name. "Yeah," he said, "we got a deal." Her father's relief was audible, a long exhale that seemed to deflate him. "Thank the Lord. Eleanor, come say hello to your— I'll be back Friday for the ceremony." Gideon turned toward the door. "Keep it simple. No church, no fuss." "Wait, don't you want to—" But Gideon was already gone, his boots crunching through snow toward a horse that looked as mean-tempered as its rider. Eleanor's father turned to her, guilt and relief warring on his weathered face. "Ellie, sweetheart, I know this isn't what you— Don't." She set down the feed bucket with careful precision. "Just don't. He's not a bad man, rough maybe, but he's got land, got resources. You'll be provided for. That's more than I deserve?" The words came out flat, dead. "More than someone like me could hope for?" Her father flinched. "That's not what I meant." But they both knew it was exactly what he meant. What everyone in Black Hollow Ridge meant when they looked at Eleanor Vale and saw a woman who'd somehow made it to 28 without landing a husband. A woman too heavy, too plain, too quiet. A woman whose mother had died giving birth to the son who'd died 3 days later, leaving Eleanor as the disappointing consolation prize. "I'll start packing," Eleanor said, and walked out of the barn before her father could see her hands shaking. "Why you?" Black Hollow Ridge wasn't much of a town. 200 souls, maybe 300 if you counted the prospectors who drifted through in summer. It huddled in a valley between mountains that spent half the year buried in snow, connected to the rest of the world by a single road that washed out every spring. People stayed because leaving took money they didn't have, or because they were running from something worse, or because they'd simply forgotten there was anywhere else to be. Eleanor had spent all 28 years of her life there, and she knew exactly what the town thought of her. "Heard about Eleanor Vale," Mrs. Patterson said at the general store 2 days before the wedding. She wasn't bothering to lower her voice. "Finally found someone desperate enough. That mountain man, Mrs. Chen, who ran the boarding house, made a tisking sound. She'll be dead within the year. You know what they say about him. What I know is that Samuel Vale's been drinking his ranch into the ground for a decade. Desperate times, desperate measures. Mrs. Patterson's voice carried clearly to where Eleanor stood 3 aisles over, examining lamp oil she couldn't afford. Though I suppose it's a mercy. At her age, with her situation, this might be her last chance at anything resembling a normal life. Eleanor's fingers tightened on the oil tin. Her situation, her size, her face, her complete failure to be pretty enough, charming enough, small enough to convince some farmer's son to overlook her father's debts and failing ranch. Still, Mrs. Chen continued, seems a shame. Selling your daughter to clear gambling debts? What kind of father? The desperate kind. Mrs. Patterson's tone shifted to something almost pitying. And what kind of daughter lets herself get sold? If she had any real prospects, any other options? Eleanor set down the lamp oil and walked out. She'd stopped crying over what the town thought years ago. Tears didn't change anything. Didn't make her prettier or smaller or more valuable. Didn't make her father's debts disappear or her mother any less dead. Tears were just water you couldn't afford to waste. She walked home through snow that had started falling again, past houses where women her age lived with husbands and children, past the church where she'd watched those same women get married while she sat in the back pew wearing her mother's old dress and pretending it didn't hurt. The Vale Ranch, what was left of it, sat 2 miles outside town. 40 acres of scrubland and failing fence posts, a barn that needed repairs Eleanor couldn't afford to make, and a house that had been slowly dying along with her father's ambitions. She found him in his study, staring at the bottom of a whiskey bottle. "Don't start," he muttered when she appeared in the doorway. "Wasn't going to say anything. Good. Because I did what I had to do. You think I wanted this? You think I wanted to—" He stopped, took another drink. "You're my daughter, Ellie. I raised you, fed you, kept a roof over your head for 28 years. I know. And this is what it comes to. This is what I'm reduced to." His voice cracked. "Your mother would be ashamed." Eleanor felt something cold settle in her chest. "Of you or of me?" Her father didn't answer, didn't need to. "I've been keeping the accounts for 6 years," Eleanor said quietly, "since you stopped being able to see the numbers straight. I've been stretching every dollar, negotiating with creditors, figuring out which bills we could delay, and which ones would get us thrown off the land. I've been holding this place together with wire and prayers while you drank away the profits from every cattle sale." Her father's face went red. "You don't talk to me like—" "And I never said a word, never complained, never asked for anything except to maybe keep the house warm enough that I didn't wake up with ice in the water basin." She paused. "So yes, Father, you did what you had to do. And so have I, every single day for 6 years." She turned and walked away before he could respond, climbed the stairs to her room, the same room she'd slept in since childhood, and started packing. She didn't have much. 3 dresses, all of them practical cotton, that had been mended so many times the original fabric was hard to identify. 2 pairs of boots, undergarments, her mother's hairbrush. A few books she'd bought with money scraped together from selling eggs. A journal where she'd been teaching herself to draw medicinal herbs. Everything she owned fit into a single trunk. 28 years of life, packed up in 30 minutes. Eleanor sat on the edge of her bed and looked around the room. The crack in the ceiling plaster she'd memorized. The window that didn't close quite right, letting in drafts that made winter nights miserable. The mark on the wall where she'd measured her height every birthday, until she turned 15 and realized she'd gotten taller than her mother ever was. This was it. This was what she was leaving behind. A room in a dying house on a failing ranch in a town that had never wanted her anyway. She should have felt sad, scared, something. Instead, she felt nothing at all. Friday came too fast and not fast enough. Eleanor woke before dawn and dressed in the least worn of her 3 dresses, dark blue cotton that made her look washed out and tired. She'd stopped trying to look pretty years ago. Pretty required hope, and hope required energy she couldn't spare. Her father was already awake, pacing the kitchen with the jerky movements of a man who'd been drinking to steady his nerves. "We should talk about—" he started. "No." "Eleanor, There's nothing to talk about, Father. You made a deal. I'm honoring it. That's the end of the discussion. She ate breakfast, eggs and bread that tasted like nothing, while her father watched her with bloodshot eyes. Finally, he cleared his throat. He's not a bad man, he said again, like repetition would make it true. Crow. He fought in the war, decorated. People say he's hard, but people say he's killed 17 men and keeps their scalps in his cabin. Eleanor didn't look up from her eggs. People say he talks to wolves. People say he once tracked a claim jumper for 40 miles through a blizzard just to put a bullet in him. People say a lot of things. Yes, they do. She set down her fork. They say I'm unmarriageable. They say I'm lucky anyone would take me. They say you're doing me a favor. She finally met her father's eyes. You want me to believe them about Gideon Crow, but not about myself? Pick one, Father. He opened his mouth, closed it, looked away. The ceremony was set for 10 o'clock at the courthouse. Just papers, no ceremony, exactly like Gideon had specified. Eleanor loaded her trunk into the wagon while her father hitched up their remaining horse, a 20-year-old mare who looked as worn out as everything else they owned. The ride into town was silent. Black Hollow Ridge's courthouse was a squat brick building that also served as the jail, the land office, and the place where old Mr. Henderson held court once a month when he wasn't too drunk to remember he was technically the judge. Gideon Crow was already there, standing by a horse that made Eleanor's father's mare look like a child's pony. He'd cleaned up, or what passed for cleaning up when you lived alone in the mountains. His coat was brushed, his hair tied back. The scar on his face stood out white against weathered skin. He nodded once when Eleanor climbed down from the wagon. Didn't smile, didn't speak. Well, her father said, too loud. Let's get this done. The ceremony took 4 minutes. Mr. Henderson read from a paper in a monotone that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. Eleanor and Gideon signed their names. Her father signed as witness. Someone produced a ring. Eleanor never found out who, and Gideon slid it onto her finger with impersonal efficiency. You're married, Mr. Henderson said. Congratulations. Nobody congratulated them. Eleanor's father tried to hug her. She tolerated it for exactly 3 seconds before stepping back. Take care of her father said to Gideon, voice thick. Gideon looked at him with eyes that gave away absolutely nothing. Your debt's cleared. We're done. It wasn't until later that Eleanor realized he hadn't actually agreed to take care of her, just stated a fact and walked away. He loaded her trunk onto a pack mule. He'd brought 2 horses and a mule, with movements that spoke of long practice. Then he turned to Eleanor. You know how to ride? First words he'd spoken directly to her. Yes. He gestured to the smaller of the 2 horses, a gray gelding with intelligent eyes. That's Ash. He's steady. Won't throw you unless you do something stupid. Eleanor took the reins and pulled herself into the saddle. The dress wasn't made for riding, but she'd spent enough time on horses that she knew how to manage. Gideon watched her settle, then nodded once. Apparently she'd passed some test, and mounted his own horse. How far? Eleanor asked. 12 miles, 3 hours in good weather. He glanced at the sky, where clouds were gathering. Might be 4 today. Then he turned his horse and started riding, apparently confident she'd follow. Eleanor looked back once. Her father stood outside the courthouse, one hand raised in something between a wave and a plea for forgiveness. Behind him, she could see faces in windows. Mrs. Patterson, Mrs. Chen, others she'd known her whole life. All watching, all judging, all thinking the same thing. That's the last we'll see of Eleanor Vale. Mountain's going to swallow her up, just like it does everything else. She turned away and followed her husband into the wilderness. Ouch. The first hour of riding, Gideon didn't speak. The second hour, he spoke exactly once. Storm's coming. We need to move faster. The third hour, Eleanor stopped caring whether he ever spoke again. They climbed. The road, if you could call it that, twisted up into mountains that got steeper and more hostile with every mile. Snow started falling, light at first, then heavier. The temperature dropped until Eleanor's breath came out in clouds and her fingers went numb inside her gloves. Gideon kept riding like the weather didn't exist, his broad back a dark shape through the snow. Eleanor followed because she had no idea where they were and because turning back wasn't an option. Even if she wanted to, and she wasn't sure she did, she'd never find her way down the mountain in this storm. Finally, when her legs were cramping and her face felt frozen, Gideon stopped. "There," he said. Eleanor looked where he was pointing and saw nothing. Just snow and trees and more snow. Then her eyes adjusted and she realized there was a cabin. It sat in a small clearing built from pine logs that had weathered to the same gray-brown as the surrounding rock. Smoke rose from a stone chimney. A barn stood to one side and what looked like a workshop on the other. It wasn't much, but it looked solid, real, lived in. Gideon dismounted and started unloading gear with the efficiency of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. Eleanor climbed down from Ash, her legs nearly buckled, and stood there uselessly while Gideon led all 3 animals toward the barn. "Coming?" he called back. Eleanor followed, stumbling through snow that was already ankle-deep. The barn was warmer than outside, but not by much. 3 stalls, hay storage, tools hung on walls with the kind of precision that spoke of a man who knew where everything belonged. Gideon unsaddled both horses and started rubbing them down. "You can help," he said, "or you can go inside. Fire's already going." Eleanor grabbed a brush and started working on Ash. The horse turned his head to look at her with one dark eye, as if evaluating whether she knew what she was doing. "I grew up on a ranch," she told him quietly. "Failing ranch, but still. I know horses." Ash snorted and went back to eating hay. They worked in silence. Gideon's movements were methodical, almost mechanical. He checked each horse's hooves, made sure they had water, pitched hay. Eleanor mirrored him, trying not to get in the way. Finally, he straightened. "That's done. You hungry?" "Yes." "Good. I made stew this morning. Should still be warm." He walked out of the barn without waiting for a response. Eleanor took a breath, the first deep breath she'd taken since the ceremony, and followed her husband toward the cabin that was apparently her new home. Peaks. The inside of the cabin was not what she'd expected. It was clean. That was the first thing that struck her. Not spotless, but organized in a way that suggested someone who valued order. The main room held a table, 4 mismatched chairs, shelves lined with supplies, and a fireplace where a pot of something bubbled. Stairs led up to what she assumed was a loft. 2 doors, one probably a bedroom, the other maybe storage. "Stew's venison," Gideon said, already ladling it into bowls. "Killed the deer 3 days ago, still fresh." He set a bowl on the table, then grabbed bread from a tin and cut 2 thick slices, added a jar of something that looked like preserved berries. "Sit," he said. It wasn't an order, wasn't a request, just a statement of what should happen next. Eleanor sat. The stew was good, better than good, rich and savory with vegetables that had been cooked until they were soft but not mushy. The bread was dense and filling. The berries were tart and sweet at the same time. Eleanor ate because she was starving, because the ride had burned through whatever breakfast she'd managed, because this might be her only chance to eat today. Gideon ate like a man who viewed food as fuel, efficient, joyless. The silence stretched. Eleanor tried to think of something to say, something that wouldn't sound stupid or desperate or scared, but her mind was blank. Every social skill she'd ever learned had apparently fled. Finally, Gideon pushed back his bowl. "You'll sleep upstairs. Loft's yours." Eleanor blinked. "What?" "The loft." He pointed at the stairs. "There's a bed, blankets, trunk for your things. That's your space." "Where will you sleep?" He gestured at the door she'd assumed was a bedroom. "In there." "You're—" Eleanor tried to process this. "We're sleeping separately?" "Unless you had other expectations." His tone was completely neutral. She stopped. What were her expectations? She'd been too numb to think beyond surviving the ceremony. "No, I didn't know what to expect." Gideon stood and carried his bowl to a basin near the fireplace, started washing it with the same methodical efficiency he brought to everything else. "I'm not interested in a wife who doesn't want to be here," he said, not looking at her. "You got sold to clear a debt. That's fact. But what we make of it, that's up to us. So what am I supposed to do?" The question came out sharper than she'd intended. "Whatever you want." He dried the bowl and set it on a shelf. "You want to sit upstairs and hate me? That's fine. You want to help around the cabin? I won't stop you. You want to leave come spring when the pass is clear? I'll give you money for a stage ticket. Eleanor stared at his back. That's it? That's your plan? I don't have a plan. I paid your father's debt because I could, and because the bank was going to take his land and turn it into another played-out mine. Seemed like a waste. He finally turned around. You were part of the deal, but I'm not interested in forcing anything, so I'm just… What? A guest? You're my wife, legally. His expression didn't change. What that means beyond the paper is something we figure out. Eleanor opened her mouth, then closed it. In 28 years of being told what she was worth, what she should want, nobody had ever suggested she might have a choice in defining herself. It was terrifying. I'll show you the loft, Gideon said. The stairs were steep and narrow. The loft was a single room with a sloped ceiling, a bed that looked handmade, a trunk at the foot of the bed, and a small window that looked out over the clearing. Simple, clean, cold. I'll bring up your trunk, Gideon said. There's extra blankets in the chest. Gets cold up here at night. Thank you. He nodded and disappeared back down the stairs. Eleanor heard him moving around below, then the sound of the door opening and closing as he went back out to the barn. She sat on the bed. The mattress was stuffed with something, hay, maybe, or pine needles, and it crackled under her weight. The blanket smelled like cedar and smoke. Through the window, she could see snow falling harder now, obscuring the trees. The sun was setting, or what passed for sunset when the sky was solid gray. Soon it would be dark, and she'd be alone in this loft while a stranger she'd married 4 hours ago slept in a room below. Eleanor lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling. She'd expected violence, expected cruelty, expected the kind of wedding night that made women whisper warnings to their daughters. Instead, she got a bowl of stew in a separate bedroom and a husband who apparently didn't care enough to pretend this was anything other than a transaction. She wasn't sure which would have been worse. The next morning, Eleanor woke to silence. Not the ordinary silence of a sleeping house, the aggressive silence of snow piled deep and wind gone still. She climbed out of bed. The loft was freezing and looked out the window. The world had disappeared. Snow had fallen all night, burying the clearing under at least 3 feet. The barn was a vague shape. The trees were white ghosts. The sky was the same color as the ground, creating the disorienting sensation that the entire world had been erased. Eleanor dressed quickly. Her breath came out in clouds, and made her way down the stairs. The main room was warm. The fire had been built up recently. Gideon sat at the table with a cup of something that steamed, reading a book that looked like it had been read 100 times before. He glanced up when she appeared. Coffee's hot. Cups are on the shelf. Eleanor poured herself a cup and sat down at the table. The coffee was strong enough to strip paint, but it was hot and caffeinated, and she was grateful for both. How long will the storm last? She asked. 2 days? Maybe 3. Gideon turned a page. We're snowed in until it clears. Can you get to the barn? The animals? Already fed them. Cleared a path at dawn. He closed the book. They're fine. Of course he had. Of course they were. Eleanor sipped her coffee and tried to figure out what she was supposed to do now. In her father's house, there had always been work. Cooking, cleaning, mending, keeping accounts, managing the ranch's slow death. Here, in this cabin with a man who apparently ran his own life with mechanical precision, she had no idea what her purpose was. I can cook, she said finally. If you want. Breakfast or… already ate. Oh. Another silence. Gideon picked up his book again. What are you reading? Eleanor asked, because the quiet was starting to make her feel like she didn't exist. He held it up. A medical text, pre-war printing, spine half broken. Field surgery manual, trying to figure out if I set my shoulder right after I dislocated it last month. Did you? Mostly. Still hurts when it rains. I could look at it, if you want. The offer came out before she'd thought about it. I mean, I'm not a doctor, but I've studied some. Medical texts, herbalism. We couldn't afford doctors growing up, so I learned what I could from books. Gideon looked at her for a long moment. You studied medicine? Not formally, just on my own. Reading, experimenting with herbs. That's why you were asking about the medicinal plants when we rode up yesterday. Eleanor hadn't realized she'd said anything out loud. I noticed some wild ginger by the trail, and what might have been mountain arnica, though it's hard to tell this time of year. Something changed in Gideon's expression. Not quite interest, but maybe the absence of disinterest. Most people don't notice plants, he said. Most people don't need to. He nodded slowly, like she'd said something that made sense to him. Then he stood and shrugged out of his coat, unbuttoned his shirt. Eleanor froze. What are you? You said you'd look at my shoulder. He pulled his shirt off entirely, turning to show her his back. Eleanor had seen men without shirts before. Working on a ranch meant seeing people at various stages of dress. But this was different, closer, more intimate, and more scarred than she'd expected. Gideon's back was a map of violence. Old wounds, most of them. Long pale lines that spoke of knife fights. A puckered circle that could only be a bullet. Burns. What looked like shrapnel scars scattered across his ribs. Your shoulder, Eleanor said, trying to keep her voice steady. The right one? Yeah. She stood and moved closer, trying to be clinical, professional. The shoulder in question showed signs of old damage. The joint sat slightly wrong, probably from being dislocated and reset improperly more than once. Move your arm, she said. Slow. Gideon raised his arm. She could see the muscle pull wrong, could see where it caught. You tore something when you said it, Eleanor said, and it healed badly. There's probably scar tissue in the joint. She touched the shoulder carefully, feeling for the problem. I can't fix it, but I could make a salve that might help with the pain. Devil's claw root, if I can find any. Willow bark, definitely. There's willow trees down by the creek. I'd need to harvest them in spring. The bark has to be fresh. She stepped back, suddenly aware of how close she was standing to a half-naked man she'd known for exactly one day. You can put your shirt back on. Gideon dressed with the same efficiency he brought to everything else. You really studied herbalism. Like I said, we couldn't afford doctors. Can you treat other things? Wounds, infections? Some. Enough to keep someone alive until you could get them to a real doctor. He nodded, filing this information away somewhere. Good to know. Then he picked up his book and went back to reading, apparently done with the conversation. Eleanor sat back down with her coffee and wondered what the hell had just happened. Oh boy. The storm lasted 2.5 days. During that time, Eleanor learned the rhythms of Gideon Crow's life. He woke at dawn, fed the animals first, always first, then himself. He read in the mornings when weather kept him inside, worked on equipment maintenance in the afternoons. He carved in the evenings small pieces of wood that became animals, tools, puzzle boxes. His hands were scarred but steady. He spoke maybe 20 words per day. Not out of cruelty, he simply didn't seem to have much to say. He never asked Eleanor questions about her life, her past, her thoughts. Never made demands. Never seemed to expect anything. It should have been a relief. Instead, it made Eleanor feel like a ghost haunting her own life. On the third morning, she woke to sunshine. Real sunshine. The kind that made the snow-covered world outside blindingly bright. She dressed and went downstairs to find Gideon already awake, staring at something near the door. What's wrong? Eleanor asked. He pointed. One of the chairs, Eleanor's chair, the one she'd been sitting in at meals, had been repaired. The back leg that had wobbled dangerously was now solid. The work was invisible unless you knew what to look for. You fixed it, Eleanor said. Gideon was already putting on his coat. Needed fixing. When? Last night. You were asleep. He walked out before she could respond, heading toward the barn through snow that had drifted as high as his waist in places. Eleanor stared at the chair. He'd fixed it in the middle of the night. Hadn't mentioned it. Hadn't expected thanks. Just saw something broken and made it whole because that's what you did with broken things. She sat down slowly, testing the chair. It was solid. Perfect. Through the window, she could see Gideon working to clear a path to the barn, his movements methodical and tireless. For the first time since arriving, Eleanor felt something other than numbness. She wasn't sure what it was yet, but it was there. Ikikit. 1 week became 2. The snow melted enough that Gideon could ride out to check his trap lines. Eleanor stayed at the cabin, trying to figure out what her purpose was in this strange new life. She cleaned, though the cabin didn't need much cleaning. She cooked, though Gideon seemed content with simple food. She organized supplies that were already organized. Mostly, she tried not to think about the fact that she'd traded one form of being unwanted for another. Then, on the 16th night, everything changed. Eleanor was in the loft reading one of Gideon's books by candlelight when she heard the noise outside. Wolves. She'd heard them before. They howled sometimes in the distance, an eerie sound that made her pull the blankets tighter. But this was different. This was close, right outside the cabin, and there were too many of them. Eleanor went to the window and looked out into darkness, broken only by moonlight on snow. 6 wolves circled the clearing. No, 7, 8, more than she'd ever seen together. They moved with purpose, working as a pack to surround something. Then she saw what they were after. Gideon's horse, the big black one he'd ridden when they got married, stood near the barn, blood streaking its shoulder. It must have gotten out somehow, gotten injured, and now the pack had it cornered. Eleanor looked towards Gideon's room. The door was closed. He'd gone to bed an hour ago and he slept like the dead. She'd learned that much. She could wake him, should wake him, but the horse didn't have an hour. It had minutes, maybe seconds. Eleanor grabbed her coat and boots, moving on instinct rather than thought. She ran downstairs past Gideon's closed door and burst out into the night. The cold hit her like a physical blow. The wolves turned as one, eyes reflecting moonlight. Eleanor had grown up around animals, had learned to read their body language, understand their behavior. These wolves were hungry and desperate, the kind of dangerous that came from a hard winter and scarce prey. "Get back," she shouted, her voice cutting through the night. "Go on, get!" The wolves didn't move. Why would they? She was smaller than the horse, slower, weaker, easier prey. Eleanor grabbed a piece of firewood from the stack by the door and ran toward the barn, putting herself between the wolves and the injured horse. She swung the wood at the nearest wolf, not hard enough to hit, just hard enough to show she would. "I said get back." The pack shifted, uncertain. They were used to prey that ran. Eleanor wasn't running. She took another step forward, making herself bigger, louder. Behind her, the horse was bleeding. She could hear its labored breathing. One of the wolves, the alpha, maybe, took a step toward her. Testing. Eleanor grabbed a handful of snow and threw it at the wolf's face. It jerked back, surprised. "That's right," Eleanor said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm not worth it. Too much trouble, too much fight." She took another step forward. "There's deer in the high valley. Easier game. Go find them and leave us alone." For a moment, one long, frozen moment, the pack considered this. Then the alpha turned and loped away. The others followed. Eleanor stood in the snow, shaking with adrenaline, until the wolves disappeared into the trees. Jesus Christ! She spun around. Gideon stood in the cabin doorway, half-dressed, rifle in hand. He must have woken when she ran outside. "The horse," Eleanor started. "I know, I see it." He walked past her toward the injured animal, moving carefully. "How the hell did you get them to leave?" "I asked them to." Gideon looked at her over his shoulder. "You asked them?" Firmly. Something that might have been a smile flickered across his face. Too quick to be sure. Together they got the horse into the barn. The shoulder wound was deep but clean, a tear, not a bite. Gideon worked with the quiet competence of someone who'd treated injuries before, cleaning the wound, stitching it closed with steady hands. "He'll live," Gideon said finally, "assuming infection doesn't set in." "I can make a poultice," Eleanor said. "Comfrey and honey. It'll help." "You know how to make that?" "I told you I studied." Gideon looked at her, really looked at her, for maybe the first time since they'd met. "You stood down 8 wolves. 9, I counted." "You stood down 9 wolves," he corrected, "to save a horse you've known for 2 weeks. He's a good horse." "He is." Gideon turned back to cleaning his tools. "Stupid thing to do, though. They could have killed you." "They could have, they didn't. Because you asked them firmly." "Yes." Gideon made a sound that might have been a laugh, might have been something else. "You're either very brave or very foolish, Eleanor Vale." "Eleanor Crow," she corrected without thinking. "Legally." He went still, then nodded slowly. Eleanor Crow. It was the first time either of them had said her new name out loud. Something shifted in the barn's cold air. Something small but undeniable. "Come on," Gideon said finally. Let's get back inside before we both freeze. They walked back to the cabin through snow that sparkled in moonlight. Gideon held the door open for her, first time he'd done that, and Eleanor walked through. Inside, he built up the fire while she stood shivering by the hearth. "You should sleep," he said. "It's late." "So should you." "I'm going to check on the horse again in a few hours. Make sure the bleeding stopped." Eleanor nodded and turned toward the stairs, then stopped. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For not telling me I was stupid. Even though I was." Gideon looked at her across the firelit room. "You weren't stupid. You saw something that needed doing and you did it. That's not stupid. That's—" He paused, like he was looking for a word he didn't have. "That's something else." Eleanor climbed the stairs to her loft and lay awake for a long time, listening to Gideon move around below. Eventually, she heard the door open and close as he went back out to check on the horse. She fell asleep wondering what the something else might be. And for the first time since arriving at the cabin, she didn't dream about escape. The morning after the wolves, Eleanor woke to find a wooden box sitting outside her door at the top of the stairs. Inside were packets of dried herbs she'd never seen before. Comfrey root, devil's claw, arnica flowers, willow bark, things she'd mentioned once in passing, weeks ago when examining Gideon's shoulder. There was no note, no explanation. She carried the box downstairs. Gideon was at the table, mending a leather harness with the same methodical precision he brought to everything. "Where did these come from?" Eleanor asked. He didn't look up. "Trading post, 12 miles east. Went yesterday while you were asleep." "You rode 12 miles to get herbs?" "You said you needed them for the poultice, for the horse." Eleanor set the box down carefully. "That's a full day's ride, round trip. Horse needed the poultice." "You could have told me you were going. I would have given you a list of—" "I remembered what you said." He tied off the leather strap and tested it. Seemed important. Eleanor stared at him. He'd ridden through February cold for an entire day to get medical supplies she'd mentioned once. Hadn't asked for thanks. Hadn't even mentioned he was going. "Thank you," she said quietly. Gideon nodded and went back to his mending. Eleanor took the herbs to the workspace near the fireplace and started preparing the poultice, grinding roots with a mortar she found on the shelf. The rhythm of the work was soothing, familiar. She mixed honey with the crushed herbs, added a bit of warm water to create the right consistency. "How's the horse?" she asked. "Fever broke this morning. He'll live." "Good." They worked in silence for a while. Eleanor found herself sneaking glances at Gideon when he wasn't looking, trying to figure out what kind of man bought medicine for a horse but barely spoke to his wife. What kind of man fixed chairs in the middle of the night and left herb boxes at doors without explanation? "Can I ask you something?" Eleanor said finally. Gideon's hands paused. "Go ahead. Why did you agree to marry me? And don't say it was just to clear my father's debt. You could have given him money without the marriage." He set down the harness and looked at her directly for the first time that morning. His eyes were the color of winter sky. "You really want to know?" "I wouldn't have asked otherwise." Gideon stood and walked to the window, staring out at the mountains. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, almost hesitant. "I saw you once. Before. 3 years ago, maybe 4. I came into town for supplies, and you were at the general store arguing with Patterson about the price of lamp oil." Eleanor had no memory of this. "You had your father's account books," Gideon continued, "and you pulled them out and showed her exactly how much he'd paid last month and the month before. Showed her the markup she was adding. Did the math right there in front of everyone." He paused. "She tried to embarrass you, called you pushy, unwomanly, said no wonder you couldn't find a husband." Eleanor remembered now. That had been a bad day. "You looked her dead in the eye," Gideon said, "and told her that if being able to count made you unwomanly, then she must be the most feminine creature alive. Then you walked out with your lamp oil at the fair price." Despite herself, Eleanor felt a small smile. She'd been proud of that line. "I thought about that for a long time after," Gideon said. "Thought about how you didn't cry, didn't apologize, just stood your ground." He turned from the window. "When your father came looking for someone to take on his debt, I remembered you. Figured anyone who could face down Mrs. Patterson could probably survive up here." "That's it? You married me because I was rude to a shopkeeper?" I married you because you were smart enough to know your own worth even when nobody else did. He picked up the harness again. Seemed like a quality worth having around. Eleanor didn't know what to say to that. Nobody had ever called her smart like it was something valuable, like it was something that mattered more than being pretty or pleasant or small. I'm not easy to live with, Gideon said, not looking at her. I don't talk much, don't like people. Got habits from the war that probably seem strange. But I needed someone who wouldn't fall apart the first time things got hard up here. Someone who could think. He tested the harness strap. You can think. That's rare. So this is what? A practical arrangement? Isn't everything? He finally looked at her again. I'm not going to pretend I married you for love, Eleanor. We both know better, but I didn't marry you out of pity either. I married you because I thought we might be able to build something that worked, something fair. And what does fair look like to you? You pull your weight, I pull mine. You respect my space, I respect yours. You need something, you tell me and I get it if I can. I need something, I ask. He set down the harness. No lies, no games, no pretending this is something it's not. Eleanor considered this. It wasn't romantic. Wasn't what young girls dreamed about when they imagined marriage. But it was honest. More honest than anything else in her life had ever been. Okay, she said. Fair. Something eased in Gideon's expression. Not quite relief, but close. I'm going to check the trap lines, he said. Be back before dark. There's venison in the cold box if you want to cook. I'll make stew. He nodded and started pulling on his coat. At the door, he paused. The herbs you're using for the poultice, you know what you're doing with them? Yes. Could you teach me? In case you're not here and something happens? Eleanor looked up from her grinding. Where would I be? I don't know. Out. Hurt. Dead. He said it matter-of-factly, like he was discussing the weather. Things happen in the mountains. Good to have more than one person who knows medicine. You want to learn herbalism. I want to learn not to watch something die because I'm ignorant. Eleanor thought about this. All right, I'll teach you. Good. Then he was gone, the door closing behind him with a soft thud. Eleanor went back to making the poultice, but her mind was elsewhere. She kept thinking about what Gideon had said, about seeing her years ago and remembering, about thinking she could survive. Nobody had ever thought she could survive anything. They'd thought she was soft, weak, fragile despite her size. But Gideon had looked at her and seen strength. She wasn't sure what to do with that. The stew was simmering by the time Gideon returned, 3 rabbits slung over his shoulder and ice in his beard. He cleaned the rabbits outside, hung them in the cold box, then came in stamping snow off his boots. Storm coming, he said. Big one. Tomorrow, maybe the day after. How big? Week-long big. Maybe more. He warmed his hands by the fire. I'll need to bring in extra firewood. Check the roof. Make sure the barn's secure. What can I do? He looked at her like he hadn't expected the question. You know how to stack firewood? I grew up on a ranch, remember? Right. Yeah. He nodded. Then you can help me stack. 2 cords should do it. They worked until full dark, carrying wood from the covered pile behind the barn and stacking it inside the mudroom. It was hard work. Eleanor's back ached and her hands were raw despite her gloves. But there was something satisfying about it, something real. That's enough, Gideon said finally. We'll finish tomorrow. Inside, Eleanor ladled out stew while Gideon added logs to the fire. They ate in the comfortable silence that had started to develop between them. Not the awkward quiet of strangers, but something easier. The wolves last night, Gideon said suddenly. That was the first time you'd seen them up close? Yes? Most people would have run, or frozen. Eleanor shrugged. Running seemed like a bad idea. Freezing seemed worse. You weren't scared? I was terrified, but the horse was bleeding and you were asleep and there wasn't time to be smart about it. She paused. Why? Would you have done something different? I would have shot them. I didn't have a gun. That's my point. You went out there with nothing but firewood and nerve. He shook his head. That's either brave or crazy. My father always said I had too much of both. He was wrong about the too much part. Eleanor looked up, surprised. Gideon was studying her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You're good in a crisis," he said. "That's worth knowing. Is that a compliment?" "It's an observation." It sounded like a compliment. Take it however you want. But there was something in his voice that might have been amusement. After dinner, Gideon carved by the fire while Eleanor organized the herbs she'd been given. She separated them by type, made notes in her journal about quantities and uses, started planning what she could cultivate come spring. "You keep a journal," Gideon observed. "Helps me remember things. Recipes, measurements, what worked and what didn't." Smart. There it was again, that word, smart, like it was something good. "Can I ask you something?" Eleanor said. "You already asked me something this morning. Can I ask you another something?" He looked up from his carving. "Go ahead." "What do you do up here? I mean, besides trap. How do you live?" "I hunt, trap, sell pelts and meat at the trading post, do some tracking work when people need things found." He turned the piece of wood in his hands. "Make enough to get by." "That's it? What else is there?" "I don't know. Friends? Family? Someone to talk to besides your wife who you barely know?" Gideon's hands stilled. "I had friends. In the war. Most of them died. The ones who didn't..." He set down the carving. "They went back to their lives. Wives, farms, normal things. I couldn't do that. Couldn't pretend I was the same person who left." "So you came here?" "So I came here." He picked up the carving again. "Been here 11 years. Suits me fine." 11 years alone. Better than being around people and feeling alone anyway. Eleanor understood that more than she wanted to admit. "What about you?" Gideon asked. "You had friends in town?" "No." "None?" "People tolerated me because of my father. But friends?" She shook her head. "You can't be friends with people who think you're a burden, or a joke, or both. They're loss." Easy to say. True to say. Gideon looked at her directly. "You stood down 9 wolves, Eleanor. Whatever those people thought about you, they were wrong." Something warm unfurled in Eleanor's chest. Something dangerous. "It's late," she said, standing abruptly. "I should sleep." "Yeah." She climbed the stairs to her loft, her heart beating too fast. Behind her, she heard Gideon banking the fire, putting away his carving tools, moving through his nighttime routine. In bed, Eleanor stared at the ceiling and tried not to think about the fact that she was starting to like her husband. That seemed like a complication neither of them needed. The storm hit 2 days later with a violence that made the previous snowfall look gentle. Wind screamed around the cabin, shaking the walls. Snow fell so thick Eleanor couldn't see the barn from the window. The temperature dropped until frost formed on the inside of the glass. Gideon went out twice a day to tend the animals, coming back each time covered in ice and barely able to feel his fingers. Eleanor heated water for him, helped him out of his frozen coat, made sure he warmed up slowly by the fire. "You don't have to do this," he said on the 3rd day, teeth chattering. "Do what?" "Take care of me. I've been managing storms alone for 11 years. And now you're not alone." Eleanor handed him a cup of hot coffee. "Drink." He drank, watching her over the rim of the cup. "You're bossy when you're worried." "I'm not worried." "You're definitely worried." "I'm practical. There's a difference." She sat down across from him. "If you freeze to death in the barn, I'm stuck here until spring with no one to teach me how to use the rifle." "I was going to teach you anyway." "Well, now you have extra motivation not to die." Gideon's mouth twitched. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was close. They fell into a rhythm during the storm. Gideon would tend the animals while Eleanor managed the cabin, keeping the fire going, cooking, melting snow for water. In the evenings, he started teaching her things: how to clean the rifle, how to load it, how to sight properly. "Don't close one eye," he said, standing behind her while she aimed at a knot in the far wall. "Keep both open. Let your brain do the work." Eleanor tried. Failed. Tried again. "Like this?" She adjusted her stance. "Better. Now breathe steady. Don't hold your breath. Just let it flow natural." His hand touched her shoulder, adjusting her position slightly. "There. That's it." Eleanor was acutely aware of how close he was standing, could feel the heat of him behind her. "What am I aiming for?" she asked. "That knot. See it?" "Yes." Don't think about pulling the trigger. Think about where you want the bullet to go. The rest will follow. Eleanor focused on the knot. Breathe like he'd told her. Squeeze the trigger slowly. The click of the empty rifle echoed in the cabin. Good, Gideon said. Do it again. They practiced until Eleanor's arms ached. Then Gideon showed her how to load the rifle for real, how to clear a jam, how to store it safely. Why are you teaching me this? Eleanor asked. Because you need to know. Why? He was quiet for a moment. Because things happen in the mountains, and I need to know that if something happens to me, you can protect yourself. Nothing's going to happen to you. You don't know that. He was right. She didn't. Okay, Eleanor said. Teach me. On the 5th day of the storm, Eleanor came downstairs to find Gideon sitting at the table with his head in his hands. What's wrong? She asked. Nothing. That's not a nothing posture. That's definitely something. He looked up. His eyes were shadowed, haunted. Bad dreams. That's all. Eleanor had heard him the night before. Heard him pacing in his room, heard sounds that might have been words or might have been something worse. The war? She asked quietly. Yeah. Do you want to talk about it? No. Okay. She started making coffee, giving him space, but when she set the cup in front of him, his hand was shaking slightly. Without thinking, Eleanor put her hand over his. You're here, she said. Not there. Here. Gideon stared at their hands. I know. Do you? He turned his hand over, gripping hers. His palm was rough and warm and solid. Yeah, he said quietly. I do now. They stayed like that for longer than necessary. When Eleanor finally pulled away, something had shifted again. Something subtle but real. The storm finally broke on the 7th day. Eleanor woke to silence. Real silence, not the howling wind silence, and knew it was over. She dressed and went downstairs to find Gideon already awake, staring out the window at a world transformed. The snow had drifted higher than the fence posts. The barn was half buried. The trees were weighted down with ice that caught the morning sun and threw rainbows across the clearing. It's beautiful, Eleanor said. It's going to take 3 days to dig out. Ever the optimist. Gideon glanced at her. I'm realistic. You're grim. Same thing in the mountains. But there was no heat in it. They were developing a rhythm to their conversations, a way of talking that felt almost like friendship. They spent the next 3 days exactly like Gideon had predicted, digging, clearing paths to the barn, to the cold box, to the woodpile, making sure the animals were fed and watered, checking for damage. On the 2nd day, Eleanor's shovel hit something that wasn't snow. What is this? She called to Gideon. He came over and looked. Root cellar. I built it my 2nd year here. Eleanor hadn't even known there was a root cellar. Can we open it? Not until spring. It's frozen shut. What's in it? Potatoes, carrots, onions, apples, things that keep. He leaned on his shovel. Why? Just curious. You never mentioned it. You never asked. Eleanor shook her head. You're impossible. So I've been told. That night, Eleanor made rabbit stew with the last of the fresh vegetables from the cold box. Gideon ate 2 bowls and looked like he wanted a 3rd, but was too proud to ask. There's more, Eleanor said. I'm fine. You're still hungry. How do you know? Because you keep looking at the pot like it owes you money. She ladled out another bowl without asking. Eat. Gideon took the bowl. You're bossy. You already said that. It's still true. Good. Someone needs to make sure you don't starve out of stubbornness. He almost smiled. Eleanor was starting to catalog his almost smiles. They were rare enough to be precious. After dinner, Eleanor worked on her journal while Gideon carved. The fire crackled. Outside, the world was quiet and cold and clean. Eleanor? Gideon said suddenly. Yes? He held up what he'd been carving. It was a small wolf caught mid-stride, so detailed she could see individual hairs suggested in the wood. For you, he said, for facing down the pack. Eleanor took it carefully. The wood was smooth and warm from his hands. The craftsmanship was incredible. This wasn't something he'd made in an evening. This had taken days, weeks maybe. When did you make this? Been working on it since that night. Finished it during the storm. He looked uncomfortable, like he wasn't sure if he'd done the right thing. You don't have to keep it if... I love it. And she meant it. Nobody had ever made her anything before. Thank you. Gideon nodded, relief visible on his face. Eleanor turned the wolf over in her hands, studying it from every angle. In the firelight, it almost looked alive. You're really talented, she said. It's just something to do with my hands. It's more than that. She looked at him. This is art. It's wood. It's both. They sat in silence for a while. Eleanor kept holding the wolf, tracing its shape with her fingers. Gideon, she said finally. Yeah? I'm glad I'm here. I know that's probably not what you expected to hear, but... She paused, trying to find the right words. I was so angry when my father sold me. Felt like my life was ending, but now I think maybe it was just changing into something different, something better. Gideon was very still. You mean that? I wouldn't say it if I didn't. He set down his carving knife and looked at her directly. I'm glad you're here too. 5 words. That was all. But they landed in Eleanor's chest like a benediction. She climbed the stairs to her loft that night with the wooden wolf clutched in her hand, placed it carefully on the trunk beside her bed where she could see it first thing every morning. In the room below, she heard Gideon moving around, heard his door close, heard the cabin settle into sleep. Eleanor lay in bed and realized she'd stopped thinking about this place as a prison. It was starting to feel like home. 2 weeks later, Eleanor was gathering eggs in the barn when she heard horses approaching. Multiple horses, moving fast. She set down the egg basket and went to the barn door. 3 riders were coming up the trail, rough-looking men on tired horses, all armed. Eleanor's stomach went cold. She started toward the cabin. Gideon was inside working on equipment. She needed to warn him, but the riders saw her and changed direction, cutting her off before she reached the door. Well now, the lead rider said. He was heavy-set with a beard that hadn't seen a razor in months. Didn't know Crow had himself a woman. Eleanor stopped walking. You're on private land. That so? The man grinned, showing yellow teeth. We got business with Crow. He around? The cabin door opened. Gideon stepped out, rifle already in hand. State your business, he said. His voice was flat, dangerous. Easy, Crow. We're just here to talk. The lead rider held up his hands. Name's Decker. This here's my associates. We got a proposition for you. Not interested. You ain't even heard it yet. Don't need to. Get off my land. Decker's smile faded. That's unfriendly. It's factual. You've got 10 seconds. There's 3 of us and 1 of you, Crow. Maybe you want to reconsider that math. Gideon's rifle didn't waver. There's 3 of you and 2 of us. And my wife's a better shot than she looks. Eleanor's hand moved to the knife at her belt. It wasn't much, but it was something. Decker looked between them. This land you're sitting on, it's valuable. Real valuable. There's copper in these hills, and men with money want to dig it out. Not my problem. See, we think it could be your problem, or it could be your opportunity. All depends on whether you're smart enough to take a payoff and disappear, or stupid enough to fight a battle you can't win. I've fought battles before, Gideon said. Won most of them. War's over, soldier. Not up here, it's not. The tension was thick enough to cut. Eleanor could see Gideon's finger resting lightly on the trigger, could see the way the other 2 riders were positioning themselves. This was going to turn violent. 3 days, Decker said finally. We'll give you 3 days to think about our offer. After that, we stop being friendly. You were never friendly. Decker's eyes went cold. 3 days, Crow. He wheeled his horse around. The other 2 followed. They rode back down the trail, not hurrying, making it clear they weren't afraid. Gideon didn't lower the rifle until they were out of sight. Inside, he said to Eleanor. She followed him into the cabin. He closed the door and bolted it, then went to the window. Who were they? Eleanor asked. Trouble. Gideon set the rifle down but kept it close. Mining company's been trying to buy up land in this valley for 2 years. Some people sold, some didn't. The ones who didn't, things happened to them. What kind of things? Accidents, fires, people disappearing. He turned to look at her. They're not going to give up. So what do we do?
We. He studied her face. This isn't your fight, Eleanor. You could leave. Go back to town. I'd give you money for... Stop. Eleanor crossed her arms. I'm not leaving. You don't know what you're saying. These men are dangerous. I stood down 9 wolves, remember? I think I can handle 3 men. This is different.
How? Wolves have rules. Men like Decker don't. Gideon ran a hand through his hair. I don't want you hurt because of my land. It's our land. Legally. I'm your wife, remember? On paper. On paper counts. Eleanor moved closer. I'm not running, Gideon. Not from them. Not from this. If you're staying, I'm staying. He looked at her for a long moment. You're sure? Completely. Something shifted in his expression. Respect, maybe, or something deeper. All right, he said. Then we prepare. Preparing for war turned out to be less dramatic than Eleanor had imagined and far more exhausting. Gideon spent the first day checking every weapon he owned. 3 rifles, 2 pistols, a shotgun that looked older than Eleanor, and enough ammunition to hold off a small army. He cleaned each one methodically, tested the mechanisms, made sure everything functioned. Eleanor watched him work, her stomach tight with anxiety she was trying hard not to show.
You really think they'll come back? She asked. Oh, they will. Gideon didn't look up from the rifle he was oiling. Men like Decker don't make threats they don't intend to keep. Maybe they were just trying to scare you. Maybe. But I'm not betting our lives on maybe. Our lives. He'd said our lives, not my life. Something about that made Eleanor's chest feel strange. What do you need me to do? She asked. Gideon set down the rifle and looked at her. You remember what I taught you about shooting? Yes. Good. Because you're going to need to remember it for real. He stood and picked up the smaller of the 2 pistols. This one's yours now. Keep it on you. All the time. Eleanor took the gun. It was heavier than she'd expected, cold and solid in her hand. I don't know if I can actually shoot someone, she said quietly. You won't know until you have to. But I'd rather you have the option and not use it than need it and not have it. Gideon moved to the window, looking out at the clearing. They'll come at night. That's how men like Decker work. They'll wait until we're asleep, try to catch us off guard. So we don't sleep. We take shifts, 1 awake, 1 resting. 4 hours on, 4 hours off. Eleanor nodded. What else? We secure the cabin. Bar the windows. Reinforce the door. Move anything valuable into the root cellar in case they try to burn us out. He turned back to her. And we make a plan for if things go wrong. What kind of plan? If they get inside, you run. Don't try to fight. Don't try to help me. You take the gray horse and you ride for the trading post. It's 12 miles east. You remember the trail? I'm not leaving you. Eleanor. No. She set the pistol down on the table with more force than necessary. I already told you, I'm not running. If you're fighting, I'm fighting. You could die. So could you, but I don't see you making plans to run. Gideon's jaw tightened. That's different. How? Because I've killed before. I know what it costs. You don't. The words hung in the air between them. Eleanor had known, abstractly, that Gideon had fought in the war, had killed. But hearing him say it out loud made it real in a way it hadn't been before. Then teach me, she said. You taught me to shoot. Teach me the rest. The rest isn't something you teach. It's something that happens to you. Then let it happen, but I'm not leaving. They stared at each other across the cabin. Finally, Gideon shook his head. You're the stubbornest woman I've ever met. Good thing you married me then. Something that might have been a smile flickered across his face. Yeah, good thing. They spent the rest of the day fortifying the cabin. Gideon nailed boards across the windows from the inside, leaving small gaps to shoot through. He reinforced the door with a timber bar that would take a battering ram to break. He moved their food stores, the medical supplies, anything irreplaceable into the root cellar that was finally thawed enough to open. Eleanor worked beside him, following his instructions, trying not to think about why they were doing this, trying not to imagine what it would feel like if Decker and his men actually came back. By nightfall, the cabin looked like a fortress. Dark, locked down, ready. First shift is mine, Gideon said. You sleep. I'm not tired. Sleep anyway. You'll need your strength. Eleanor wanted to argue, but she could see the logic. She climbed up to her loft and lay down fully clothed, the pistol within reach on the trunk beside the wooden wolf. She didn't think she'd be able to sleep, but exhaustion pulled her under within minutes. She woke to Gideon's hand on her shoulder and sat up so fast she nearly cracked her head on the sloped ceiling. "Easy," he said. "It's just me. Your shift." Eleanor climbed down the stairs, still groggy. Gideon had made coffee, strong enough to strip paint, like always, and she drank it gratefully while he gave her instructions. "Sit by the window. Watch the tree line. If you see movement, wake me. Don't wait. Don't investigate. Just wake me. What if it's just an animal? Wake me anyway." "Gideon, please." The word came out rough, unpracticed. "Just wake me." Eleanor nodded. "Okay." He went to his room, leaving the door cracked. Eleanor settled by the window with the rifle across her lap and watched the darkness. The mountains at night were never truly quiet. Wind moved through the trees, small animals rustled in the underbrush. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called. Normal sounds, peaceful sounds. But tonight they felt menacing. Every shadow looked like a man creeping closer. Every sound could be footsteps. Eleanor's hands gripped the rifle until her knuckles ached. Nothing happened. 4 hours later, she woke Gideon. They switched places. She tried to sleep but mostly stared at the ceiling, listening to him move around below. They kept up the shifts for 2 days. 2 long, exhausting days where nothing happened except them slowly wearing themselves down with fear and lack of rest. On the 3rd morning, Eleanor came downstairs to find Gideon slumped at the table, asleep sitting up with his head on his arms. She should have woken him, should have told him to go to bed. Instead, she made coffee quietly and took his watch, letting him sleep. He woke an hour later with a start, hand going immediately to his rifle. "Why didn't you wake me?" His voice was rough with sleep and accusation. "You needed rest." "That's not how this works. We agreed on shifts." "You're exhausted, Gideon. You're running yourself into the ground. Better than being dead. You're not going to be much use to anyone if you collapse." Eleanor set a cup of coffee in front of him. 1 hour of extra sleep isn't going to kill us. He wanted to argue. She could see it in his face, but he was too tired to find the energy. "Don't do it again," he said finally. "Fine." They drank their coffee in silence. Outside the sun was rising, painting the snow with shades of pink and gold. "Maybe they're not coming," Eleanor said. "Maybe Decker was just talking." Maybe. But neither of them believed it. The attack came on the 4th night, exactly when Gideon had predicted. Eleanor was on watch, sitting by the window with the rifle. It was maybe 2 in the morning. The moon was half full, giving just enough light to see by. She saw the movement in the trees and thought at first it was a deer. Then the shape resolved into a man. Then another. Then a third. Eleanor's heart kicked into her throat. She moved away from the window and went to Gideon's door, pushing it open. "Gideon? They're here." He was awake instantly, rolling out of bed with the rifle already in his hands. "How many?" 3. Maybe more. I only saw 3. That's all of them. Decker doesn't have more than that. He moved to the window, peering through one of the shooting gaps. "They're spreading out, trying to surround us." "What do we do?" "We wait. Let them make the first move." He glanced at her. "You have your pistol?" Eleanor touched the gun at her belt. "Yes." "Stay away from the windows. If shooting starts, get behind the table. It's solid oak, should stop most bullets." "What about you?" "I'll be fine. I've done this before." Before Eleanor could respond, something crashed through the window. A bottle with a flaming rag stuffed in the top. Fire splashed across the floor. "Damn it!" Gideon grabbed the water bucket and threw it on the flames. But more bottles came through other windows. The cabin filled with smoke and the smell of burning kerosene. "They're trying to smoke us out!" Gideon shouted over the roar of flames. "Get to the door!" Eleanor ran for the door as Gideon fired through one of the shooting gaps. The rifle's report was deafening in the enclosed space. Outside, someone screamed, "Got one!" Gideon worked the bolt, fired again. 2 left! But the fire was spreading faster than he could shoot. The walls were catching. The smoke was getting thick enough to choke on. "We have to get out," Eleanor shouted. "That's what they want.
They'll pick us off the second we open that door. We'll burn if we stay. Gideon's face was grim in the firelight. He knew she was right. The barn, he said. We make a run for the barn. It's dark. They might lose us in the confusion. You ready? Eleanor pulled out her pistol. Her hands were shaking, but she gripped the gun tight. Ready. On 3. 1. The door exploded inward. Gideon was thrown backward by the blast. Eleanor saw him hit the floor, saw blood on his face, saw him try to get up and fall. Decker stepped through the smoke, gun drawn. Told you, Crow. 3 days. Everything slowed down. Eleanor saw Gideon on the floor, stunned, bleeding. Saw Decker raising his gun. Saw the choice in front of her, run or fight. Save herself or save him. The town's voices echoed in her head. Worthless, unwanted, a burden. But Gideon had never called her those things, had never looked at her like she was less than, had given her herbs and carved her wolves and taught her to shoot and said she was smart like it mattered, had made her feel for the first time in her life like she was worth something. Eleanor raised her pistol and fired. The recoil nearly knocked her down. The sound was enormous. Her ears rang. Decker staggered, grabbing his shoulder. You shot me! You crazy! Eleanor fired again. Missed. Fired a third time. This one caught him in the leg. Decker went down hard, cursing. Behind him, his 2 remaining men appeared in the doorway, weapons drawn. Eleanor stepped in front of Gideon. She was terrified. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the gun. But she stood there anyway, between her husband and the men who wanted to kill him. Get back, she said. Her voice didn't sound like her own. Get back or I swear I'll shoot you both. The 2 men looked at each other. Looked at Decker bleeding on the floor. Looked at this woman they'd dismissed as nothing. She's bluffing, one of them said. Does she look like she's bluffing? The other responded. Behind Eleanor, she heard Gideon moving, heard him trying to get up. Stay down, she said without turning around. I've got this. Eleanor. I said I've got this. The man on the left took a step forward. Eleanor pulled the trigger. The bullet punched through the door frame next to his head. He froze. Next one goes in your chest, Eleanor said. Your choice. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Decker groaned from the floor. Get me out of here. This ain't worth dying over. The 2 men grabbed their boss and dragged him backward through the door. Eleanor followed, guns still trained on them as they stumbled toward their horses. This isn't over, Crow, Decker shouted as they threw him over a saddle. You hear me? This isn't... Eleanor fired into the air. The horses spooked and ran, carrying the 3 men away into the darkness. She stood in the clearing, gun still raised, until she couldn't hear the hoofbeats anymore. Then her legs gave out. She sat down hard in the snow, the pistol falling from her nerveless fingers. Her whole body was shaking. She couldn't breathe right, couldn't think. She'd shot someone, had actually pointed a gun at another human being and pulled the trigger. Behind her, she heard movement. Gideon appeared, limping, blood streaming from a cut on his forehead. He dropped to his knees beside her. Eleanor, look at me. She couldn't look at him, couldn't look at anything. I shot him, she whispered. I actually shot him. I know. He could have died. They all could have died. But they didn't. You scared them off. Gideon's hands found her shoulders. You saved us. I didn't mean to. Eleanor finally looked at him. You were on the floor, and he had his gun, and I couldn't let him. I know. Gideon pulled her against his chest. His heart was pounding hard enough that she could feel it. You did good. You did so good. Eleanor buried her face in his shoulder and started to shake. Not crying, just shaking with reaction, with terror, with the aftermath of violence. Gideon held her while the cabin burned behind them, held her while she fell apart, held her until she could breathe again. Finally, she pulled back. You're hurt. I'm fine. You're bleeding. That's not fine. Eleanor wiped her eyes and tried to focus. We need to get you inside, clean that cut. Inside is on fire. They both turned to look. The cabin was fully engulfed now, flames reaching toward the sky. Everything they owned was burning. The barn, Gideon said. Come on. He tried to stand and nearly fell. Eleanor caught him, surprised by how much of his weight she was suddenly supporting. How bad are you hurt? She asked.
Took a piece of the door to the head. Might have cracked a rib. He leaned on her heavily. I'll live.
They made it to the barn. Inside, the animals were agitated from the fire and gunshots, but alive. Gideon collapsed onto a hay bale while Eleanor found a lantern and lit it. In the flickering light, she could see the full extent of the damage. The cut on his head was deep, still bleeding. His left side was already bruising. He was holding his ribs like they hurt. I need to clean this, Eleanor said. Stay still. She found a relatively clean cloth and a bucket of water. Started washing the blood away from his face. Gideon winced but didn't pull away. This is going to need stitches, Eleanor said. You know how to do that? I've read about it, never actually done it. There's a first time for everything. Gideon tried to smile, failed. Today's been full of first times. Eleanor's hands stilled. I shot a man. You did. I thought I couldn't. Thought I'd freeze up if it came to it. But you didn't. Gideon caught her hand. You stood between me and them. Nobody's ever done that before. Of course they have. No, they haven't. His eyes were serious, intense. In the war, men fought beside me, but they were fighting for their country, their unit, not for me specifically. And after, he paused. After, I made sure nobody had a reason to fight for me. Didn't want to owe anyone, didn't want anyone to owe me. So what changed? You. He said it simply, like it was obvious. You changed things. Eleanor's throat tightened. I don't understand. You're my wife. You could have run. Could have left me on that floor and saved yourself. Decker would have let you go. You heard him. His fight was with me, not you. Gideon's grip on her hand tightened. But you stayed. You stood over me with a gun in your hand and you fought for me. Because you're my husband. On paper. On paper counts. Eleanor threw his own words back at him. You said that yourself. This is our land, our home, our life. She paused. Our fight. Gideon stared at her for a long moment. Then he pulled her down and kissed her. It wasn't gentle, wasn't careful. It was desperate and fierce and tasted like smoke and blood and fear. Eleanor kissed him back just as hard, her hands fisting in his shirt, all the terror and adrenaline of the night pouring out in this moment. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathing hard. I need to stitch your head, Eleanor said shakily. Yeah, you do. She found thread and a needle in the barn supplies, washed them as best she could. Her hands were steady now, steadier than they'd been all night. This is going to hurt, she warned. I know. Eleanor took a breath and pushed the needle through skin. Gideon didn't make a sound, just sat there while she worked, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on something in the middle distance. She tied off the last stitch. Done. Good work. How do you know? You can't see it. I can feel it. You've got steady hands. Eleanor cleaned up the supplies, her mind still reeling. The kiss, the fight, the cabin burning, all of it felt surreal. What do we do now? She asked. Gideon looked toward where the cabin was still burning. The flames were starting to die down now, leaving behind nothing but charred logs and ash. We rebuild, he said. That's what you do in the mountains. Something breaks, you build it again. You make it sound simple. It's not simple. It's just necessary. He turned back to her. But we've got the barn. We've got the animals. We've got the root cellar with our supplies. We can live here while we rebuild. In a barn. I've lived in worse places. Eleanor thought about the cabin, about her loft, her bed, the wooden wolf that was now ash, about the herbs Gideon had ridden 12 miles to get for her, about the chair he'd fixed in the middle of the night, all of it gone. I'm sorry, Gideon said quietly. This is my fault. If I'd just sold them the land— No, Eleanor cut him off. Don't apologize for having principles, for standing your ground. That's not something to be sorry for. It cost us everything. It cost us a building. That's not everything. She looked at him. We're alive. We're together. We scared off 3 armed men and lived to tell about it. I'd say that's something worth keeping. Gideon smiled, really smiled, not just the almost smile Eleanor had been cataloging. It transformed his face, made him look younger, less haunted. How are you always so practical? he asked. Someone has to be. You're too busy being grim. Realistic.
Same thing in the mountains. Eleanor threw his words back at him again. He laughed, actually laughed out loud, the sound rough and surprised, like he'd forgotten how. They sat in the barn while the cabin finished burning, while the sky started to lighten with dawn, while the world slowly put itself back together. Eleanor, Gideon said finally. Yes?
When I got married, I thought I was just clearing a debt, doing someone a favor, making a practical arrangement. He looked at her. I was wrong. About what? About what we could be, what this could become. He reached out and took her hand. I don't know what to call what's happening between us. Don't know the right words for it, but I know I don't want to lose it. Eleanor's heart was pounding. You won't. You sure about that? Completely. They sat there holding hands while the sun rose over the mountains, painting the snow and the ash and the barn with shades of gold. The next few days were brutal. They lived in the barn, sleeping in the hayloft, cooking over a small fire they built in a cleared area outside. It was cold and uncomfortable, and nothing like the cabin had been. But they were alive. Together. And somehow that made it bearable. Gideon rode to the trading post on the third day to get supplies and report what happened. He came back with lumber, nails, and news. Decker's gone, he said. Left the territory. Word is his bosses weren't happy he botched the job and got himself shot by a woman in the process. Good. The mining company's backing off for now. Too much attention on them after the attack. Gideon started unloading supplies. We're safe. For a while, anyway. Eleanor helped him carry lumber. How long will it take to rebuild? Depends. If it's just me. 2 months, maybe 3. If you help? He looked at her. 6 weeks if we push. Then we push. They started the next morning. Eleanor had never built anything more complicated than a chicken coop, but she learned fast, learned how to measure and cut lumber, how to fit joints, how to use a hammer without smashing her fingers. Gideon was a patient teacher. He showed her things once, let her try, corrected her when she got it wrong. Never made her feel stupid for not knowing. They worked from dawn until dark, breaking only to eat and tend the animals. Eleanor's hands blistered, then calloused. Her muscles ached in ways she didn't know were possible. But the cabin started to take shape. Walls went up, a roof, window frames, a door. One night, 3 weeks into the rebuild, they were sitting by their fire outside the barn. Eleanor was flexing her sore hands when Gideon spoke. You could have left, that night, after the fight. Eleanor looked at him. No, I couldn't have. Why not? Because I didn't want to. That simple? That's simple. She paused. Why did you kiss me? In the barn. After. Gideon stared into the fire. Because I thought I was going to die on that floor. And the last thing I saw before Decker came through the door was you, and I thought... He stopped. Started again. I thought that if I died, I'd regret never knowing what it was like to kiss you. And now you know. Yeah, now I know. He looked at her. Was it okay? I didn't ask first, should have asked. It was more than okay. Good, because I'd like to do it again, if that's all right with you. Eleanor's heart kicked. Now? If you want. She did want, had been wanting for weeks, maybe longer, without quite admitting it to herself. Yes, she said. I want. This kiss was different from the first. Slower, gentler, but no less intense. When they pulled apart, Gideon rested his forehead against hers. I'm not good at this, he said quietly. At feelings, at saying what I mean. The war took something from me, made me hard, made me... You're not as hard as you think you are, Eleanor interrupted. You fix chairs in the middle of the night. You carve wolves. You ride 12 miles for herbs. That's not hard. That's kind. It's different with you. Why? Because you see me. Not what I was or what I did or what people say about me. Just me. He pulled back to look at her. Nobody's ever done that before. Then they were fools. Gideon smiled. Maybe, but I'm grateful for fools. If they'd seen what you see, one of them might have married you first. And that would have been terrible.
For me? Yeah, absolutely terrible. Eleanor laughed and kissed him again. They finished the cabin 6 weeks after the attack, exactly like Gideon had predicted. It was smaller than the original, simpler, but it was solid and warm and theirs. On the first night in the new cabin, Eleanor stood in the main room and looked around. The table Gideon had built, the shelves she'd helped install, the fireplace they'd laid together, stone by stone. "What do you think?" Gideon asked from the doorway. "I think it's perfect." "It's not. It's rough. Still needs work." "It's perfect," Eleanor repeated, "because we made it together." Gideon came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "You know what's missing?" "What?" "A bedroom. For both of us." Eleanor turned in his arms. "Both of us?" "If you want. If you're ready for—" He stopped. Started again. "I'm asking if you want to share a room, share a bed, be married for real, not just on paper." Eleanor's pulse was racing. "Are you sure? I've never been more sure of anything." He cupped her face in his scarred hands. "I love you, Eleanor. Don't know when it happened. Maybe that first night when you faced down the wolves. Maybe before, when I saw you in town standing up to Mrs. Patterson. Maybe it's been happening this whole time and I was too stubborn to notice. But I love you." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. "I love you too." "Yeah?" "Yeah." He kissed her. And this time, when he picked her up and carried her toward the bedroom they'd share, Eleanor knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. In a cabin in the mountains with a man who'd been a stranger 4 months ago and was now the most important person in her world. The woman everyone mocked had finally found someone who saw her worth. And that was better than any revenge she could have imagined. Spring came to the mountains like a long-held breath finally released. The snow melted in patches, revealing ground that Eleanor had never seen without white covering it. Wildflowers pushed through the mud, tiny purple ones Gideon said were called mountain bells, yellow ones that didn't have a name he knew. The creek behind the cabin swelled with runoff, running fast and loud enough to hear from inside. Eleanor stood at the window watching it all, Gideon's arm around her waist, and felt something she'd never expected to feel in her life. Content. "What are you thinking about?" Gideon asked. "How different everything is from 6 months ago." "Good different or bad different?" Eleanor leaned into him. "Definitely good." They'd settled into a life together that surprised them both with how well it worked. Gideon still woke before dawn to tend the animals, but now Eleanor woke with him, made coffee while he worked, greeted him when he came back inside with cold hands and wind-reddened cheeks. They ate breakfast together, planned their days, moved through the cabin in a rhythm that felt like it had always existed. At night, they shared the bedroom they'd built, shared a bed that Gideon had made wider than necessary, with a mattress Eleanor had stuffed with fresh hay and lavender from her growing collection of herbs. The first few nights had been awkward, two people learning each other in ways that required trust neither of them had given easily before. But they'd figured it out, figured each other out. Eleanor had learned that Gideon sometimes woke from nightmares gasping for air, convinced he was back in the war. Learned that the only thing that helped was her hand on his chest, her voice reminding him where he was, who he was with. Gideon had learned that Eleanor talked in her sleep sometimes, usually about plants or recipes or chickens. Learned that she ran cold at night and burrowed against him for warmth without even waking up. They'd learned how to be married, not the paper version, the real version. "I need to ride to the trading post today," Gideon said, breaking into her thoughts. "We're low on flour and salt, probably be gone most of the day." "I'll come with you." He looked surprised. "You sure? It's a long ride." "I've done it before. Besides, I want to see if they have any new herb seeds." Eleanor had been planning a proper garden, something more ambitious than the few plants she'd been cultivating in pots. "And I should probably show my face in civilization occasionally, make sure people remember I exist." "People remember, trust me." Gideon's tone was dry. "Mrs. Patterson asks about you every time I'm there, wants to know if you're still alive." "What do you tell her?" "That you're thriving." He kissed the top of her head. "Because you are." They saddled the horses an hour later. Ash greeted Eleanor with his usual dignified nod, like he was granting her permission to ride him. Gideon's black horse, a monster named Smoke,
stamped impatiently while Gideon checked the saddle.
The ride down the mountain was easier than Eleanor remembered from that first trip. The trail had dried out, and she knew the path now, knew which rocks to avoid, where the ground dipped unexpectedly, which turns were sharper than they looked. "You've gotten better at this," Gideon observed. "At what?" "Riding, sitting the saddle. You don't look like you're fighting the horse anymore." Eleanor patted Ash's neck. "I stopped trying to control everything. Turns out horses appreciate that."
"Most things appreciate that." "Are we still talking about horses?" Gideon's mouth quirked. "Maybe." The trading post sat at a crossroads where 3 mountain trails met. It was bigger than Eleanor expected. A sprawling log building with a porch that wrapped around 2 sides and windows that actually had glass. A few other horses were tied outside, and smoke rose from the chimney. They dismounted and tied up their horses. Gideon held the door open for Eleanor, and she walked into organized chaos. The trading post sold everything: food, tools, ammunition, fabric, medicine, seeds, traps, rope, nails, books, tobacco, whiskey. It smelled like coffee and leather and sawdust. 3 people were inside browsing. 2 men Eleanor didn't recognize, and a woman who looked vaguely familiar. Behind the counter stood a man in his 50s with gray hair and sharp eyes. "Crow," he said by way of greeting. "Didn't expect you for another week. Running low on supplies, winter lasted longer than usual." Gideon pulled out a list. "Need flour, salt, coffee, sugar, and whatever seeds my wife wants." The man's eyebrows went up. "Your wife?" "Eleanor Crow." Gideon's tone left no room for questions. "This is Jack Monroe. He runs the post." Monroe looked Eleanor over with undisguised curiosity. "So you're the woman who shot Decker?" Eleanor felt her face heat. "News travels." "News like that?" "Yeah, it travels fast." Monroe grinned. "Decker's been telling everyone who'll listen that he got ambushed by a gang of armed settlers. Says there were at least 6 of you." "There were 2 of us," Eleanor said. "I know. Makes the story even better." Monroe started gathering supplies from the shelves. "You became something of a legend around here. The woman who stood down the mining company." Eleanor glanced at Gideon. He was trying not to smile. "I just did what needed doing," Eleanor said. "Most people don't. They run or they fold. You didn't." Monroe set a sack of flour on the counter. "That's worth respecting." While Gideon settled up the bill, Eleanor wandered over to the seed section. They had more variety than she'd expected. Tomatoes, beans, squash, carrots, herbs she'd only read about in books. Medicinal plants that would be worth their weight in gold come winter. She was examining packets of feverfew when someone spoke behind her. "Eleanor Vale? Is that you?" Eleanor turned to find the woman she'd half recognized. After a moment, the name came to her. Sarah Chen, Mrs. Chen's daughter. They'd been in school together years ago, before Sarah had married and moved away. "It's Eleanor Crow now," Eleanor said. "Right. I heard about that." Sarah moved closer, lowering her voice. "I also heard about what happened, with the mining company. Are you all right?" "I'm fine." "It must have been terrifying." "It was, but we managed." Sarah glanced over at Gideon, who was loading supplies into saddlebags. "He seems different than what people said." "People say a lot of things. Most of them are wrong." "Are you happy?" The question came out blunt, honest. Eleanor thought about it, about the cabin they'd built together, about waking up every morning next to someone who saw her as an equal, about the life they were making in the mountains. "Yeah," she said, "I really am." Sarah smiled. "Good. You deserve that." She paused. "For what it's worth, I never believed what they said about you in town, about you being unmarriageable or whatever. I always thought you were just too smart to settle for the idiots available." Eleanor felt her throat tighten. "Thank you. Come visit sometime. I'm living about 8 miles south of here now, married a rancher. We'd love to have you and your husband for dinner." "I'd like that." They exchanged a few more pleasantries before Sarah left. Eleanor picked out her seeds: feverfew, echinacea, twajim, calendula, plus vegetables for eating, and brought them to the counter. Monroe tallied them up. "You planning to start a garden?" "A big one. Need to be able to make medicines up there." Can't always ride 12 miles every time someone needs help. Smart thinking. Monroe bagged the seeds. You know anything about doctoring? Some. Mostly herbs and basic field medicine. Might want to talk to Doc Hartley next time you're in town. He's getting old, could probably use someone to teach, especially someone willing to ride out to the mountain settlements. Eleanor filed that away. I'll think about it. Gideon finished loading the horses and came back inside. Ready? Ready. They were almost to the door when it opened and a man walked in. Tall, well-dressed in a way that screamed money, with dark hair and a smile that was probably charming if you didn't look too close at the eyes. Well, the man said, Gideon Crow. Been hoping to run into you. Gideon went very still. Hale. The name hit Eleanor like cold water. Victor Hale, the mining businessman, the one who'd sent Decker and his men. Relax, Crow. I'm not here for trouble. Hale held up his hands. I'm here to apologize. What Decker did, that wasn't authorized. He went rogue. The company wants you to know we had nothing to do with it. That's convenient. It's the truth. When we heard what happened, we terminated his contract immediately. Hale's smile widened. We're a legitimate business, not a gang of thugs. You sent him to intimidate me into selling. We sent him to make an offer. What he did beyond that was his own choice. Hale's gaze shifted to Eleanor. And you must be Mrs. Crow. I heard quite a bit about you. They say you shot Decker twice. 3 times, Eleanor corrected. I missed once. Hale laughed. Well, I came here today hoping to make amends. The company is willing to offer substantial compensation for what you went through. Call it a settlement for damages. We don't want your money, Gideon said. Everyone wants money, Crow. It's just a matter of how much. Hale pulled out a paper from his coat. We're prepared to offer you $10,000. The number hung in the air. $10,000. That was more money than Eleanor had seen in her entire life, more than her father's ranch had been worth, more than most people in Black Hollow Ridge would make in 10 years. And in exchange, Gideon asked, you leave. Simple as that. Take the money, go somewhere more hospitable, start over. We get the land, you get enough money to buy 3 ranches anywhere else in the territory. Hale set the paper on the counter. Think about it. No more harsh winters, no more isolation. You could move to a real town, have neighbors. Your wife could have a proper house, a proper life. Eleanor felt Gideon tense beside her. We'll think about it, she said before Gideon could respond. Both men looked at her in surprise. We'll think about it, she repeated. That's a lot of money. We'd be fools not to at least consider it. Hale's smile turned genuine. Smart woman. I like that. He tipped his hat. You have 1 week to decide. After that, the offer expires. He walked out, leaving the paper on the counter. Gideon stared at it like it was a snake. You want to think about it? Don't you? No. Gideon, that's our home, Eleanor. We built it, together. I'm not selling it. I know, but $10,000? I don't care if it's $1 million. That land is ours. He turned to face her fully. Unless you want to leave. If you do, just say it. We'll take the money and go. Eleanor looked at her husband, at the fierce pride in his eyes, at the fear underneath it that she might actually want to leave. I don't want to leave, she said quietly. I just wanted you to know you have a choice. We have a choice. We're not trapped there. Some of the tension left Gideon's shoulders. You're sure? I'm sure. Eleanor picked up the paper and handed it back to Monroe. Can you give this back to Mr. Hale when you see him? Tell him we're not interested. Monroe took the paper with something like respect in his eyes. Will do, Mrs. Crow. They rode home in silence. Eleanor could feel Gideon's mood, dark and churning. She let him be, knowing he needed to work through whatever he was thinking. They were almost back to the cabin when he finally spoke. I'm sorry. Eleanor looked over at him. For what? For snapping at you, for not even considering the offer. That was your decision too. I made my decision. I chose to stay. But you shouldn't have to stay in a cabin in the mountains because of me. You could have a real house, servants maybe, a garden that doesn't have to survive winter, friends nearby. He paused. Everything I can't give you. Eleanor pulled Ash to a stop. Gideon stopped beside her. Do you know what I had before I married you? Eleanor asked. A room in a dying house on a failing ranch in a town that thought I was worthless. I had a father who saw me as a burden and neighbors who gossiped about me like I was entertainment. I had nothing and no one and no hope that anything would ever change. Eleanor. Now I have a husband who thinks I'm smart, who teaches me things and learns from me, who built me a cabin with his own hands and carves me wolves and rides 12 miles for herbs because I mentioned them once. Her voice was steady. Sure. I have work that matters. A garden I'm planning. A reputation as the woman who stood down a mining company. I have a life that's mine, not something I settled for because I had no other options. Gideon was staring at her.
So no, Eleanor continued. I don't want servants or a big house or a garden that doesn't have to fight winter. I want this. I want you. I want the life we're building. She urged Ash closer until their legs were nearly touching. Don't you understand? You didn't trap me here, Gideon. You freed me. He reached across the space between their horses and took her hand. I love you.
I love you too. Which is why you need to trust me when I say I'm choosing this. Choosing us. Not because I have to, because I want to. They rode the rest of the way home hand in hand, the horses patient with their awkward gait. That night, lying in bed with Gideon's arm around her, Eleanor thought about Hale's offer, about the life they could have had somewhere else, and felt nothing but relief that they'd said no. 2 weeks later, Eleanor was in her garden, still just a plot of turned earth, but getting closer to something real, when she heard horses approaching, multiple horses, again. Her stomach dropped. She grabbed the pistol she now kept with her always and started toward the cabin. But these riders weren't coming fast or aggressive. They were moving slow, almost cautious. Gideon emerged from the barn, rifle in hand. Together they watched as 5 riders crested the hill. At the front was Doc Hartley, the physician from Black Hollow Ridge. Behind him were 4 people Eleanor didn't recognize. Crow, Mrs. Crow, Doc Hartley called. We're not here for trouble. I've got a sick woman who needs help. Gideon and Eleanor exchanged glances. Then Eleanor stepped forward. Bring her inside. The sick woman was barely conscious, burning with fever. The other 3 people were her husband and 2 grown children, all looking terrified.
How long has she been like this? Eleanor asked, helping them get the woman onto the bed. 3 days, the husband said. Started with chills, then fever, then she stopped making sense. Doc Hartley said you might be able to help. Eleanor looked at Doc Hartley. Why bring her to me? Because I heard you know herbs, and this looks like mountain fever. I've seen it before. Standard medicine doesn't touch it, but some of the old remedies do. The Shoshone used to treat it with a tea made from... He trailed off. Hell, I don't remember. I'm hoping you do. Eleanor examined the woman. High fever, confusion, a rash spreading across her chest. She'd read about this, had seen it described in one of the medical texts Gideon owned. It's mountain fever, Eleanor confirmed. Also called tick fever. She probably got bitten a week ago, maybe more. She turned to the husband. Has she been in the high meadows recently? We were camping up near Boulder Creek, wanted to scout for a homestead. That confirmed it. Boulder Creek was known for ticks this time of year. I can treat her, Eleanor said, but it's going to take time, days, maybe a week, and I'll need help. Whatever you need, the husband said desperately. Eleanor started giving orders. Gideon, send someone to collect willow bark and yarrow from the creek. Doc Hartley, I need you to help me bring the fever down while I prepare the tea. The rest of you, boil water and find clean cloths. They worked for hours. Eleanor made a tea from herbs she'd been cultivating, yarrow, boneset, echinacea. Got the woman to drink it despite her semi-conscious state. Applied cool compresses to bring the fever down. Monitored her breathing, her pulse. Doc Hartley watched everything she did, asking questions, taking notes. Where did you learn this? He asked. Books, mostly. Trial and error. Desperation. Eleanor adjusted the compress. My father couldn't afford doctors. I had to figure out medicine on my own. You're better than half the trained physicians I know. I'm just doing what works. By nightfall, the woman's fever had broken. She was sleeping naturally instead of the restless half-consciousness she'd been in before. Her husband wept with relief. Thank you, he said to Eleanor. We can't pay you much, but I don't want payment. Just make sure she rests for at least a week. No traveling, no heavy work, and keep her hydrated. They stayed overnight in the barn. Eleanor wouldn't turn them out in the dark with a sick woman.
The next morning, the patient was awake and lucid, weak but clearly recovering. Doc Hartley pulled Eleanor aside before they left.
I meant what I said. You're good at this. Better than good. He paused. I'm getting old, Mrs. Crow. My hands aren't as steady as they used to be, and the ride to some of these remote settlements is getting harder. I could use an apprentice, someone to learn what I know and eventually take over. Eleanor's heart kicked. You're offering to teach me?
I'm offering to teach you what I know about conventional medicine if you teach me what you know about herbs. Between us, we might actually be able to keep people alive in these mountains. He smiled. What do you say? Eleanor looked over at Gideon, who was helping load the woman onto a horse. He caught her eye and nodded. Yes, Eleanor said. I'd like that. After the riders left, Eleanor and Gideon stood in the clearing watching them disappear down the trail. A doctor's apprentice, Gideon said. That's something. Is it okay? I'd have to ride into town sometimes, maybe stay overnight if someone's sick. Of course it's okay. Why wouldn't it be? I just thought you might not want me gone. Gideon turned to face her. Eleanor, I married you because you're smart and capable and strong. You think I want you to waste all that staying here making me dinner? He shook his head. No, you should do this. Help people. Make a difference.
You really mean that? I really mean that. He pulled her close. Besides, it'll make the homecoming better. Eleanor laughed and kissed him. Over the next few months, Eleanor split her time between the cabin and working with Doc Hartley. She learned how to set bones, stitch wounds, deliver babies, taught him about herbal remedies, poultices, tinctures. Word spread about the woman in the mountains who could cure things regular doctors couldn't. People started showing up at the cabin. A rancher with a gash from a barbed wire fence, a child with croup, a woman with a difficult pregnancy. Eleanor treated them all, sometimes with Gideon's help, sometimes on her own. The garden she'd planned grew into something impressive. Rows of medicinal herbs, vegetables for eating, flowers because they were beautiful and beauty mattered. Gideon built her a greenhouse for the plants that needed extra protection from the harsh mountain winters. Sarah Chen made good on her invitation. She and her husband became regular visitors, and through them, Eleanor met other people in the scattered mountain communities. Slowly, she built a circle of acquaintances that felt almost like friendship. The cabin expanded. Gideon added a room that Eleanor used for treating patients who needed overnight care, built better furniture, carved decorations into the doorframe and the bedposts and anywhere else Eleanor admired his work. Eleanor made curtains, rugs, cushions, filled the shelves with books they bought or traded for, made the cabin feel less like a fortress and more like a home. They were building a life, a real life, together. One evening in late summer, they were sitting on the porch watching the sun set behind the mountains. Eleanor was shelling peas, Gideon was carving, and everything felt peaceful in a way Eleanor had stopped believing was possible. Can I ask you something? Gideon said. Always. Do you ever regret it? Marrying me, staying here. Eleanor set down the peas and looked at him, really looked at him, at the scars on his face and hands, at the gray in his hair that was more pronounced than it had been 6 months ago, at the way he held himself, still cautious, still guarded, but softer than he'd been when they met. Not once, she said. Do you? Regret marrying you? No, never. He set down his carving. But I sometimes wonder if you'd be happier somewhere else, somewhere easier. I'm happy here. Even when it's hard? Especially when it's hard. Because when it's hard, we figure it out together. And that matters more than easy ever could. Gideon reached over and took her hand. I don't deserve you. Yes, you do. And I deserve you. We deserve each other. That's how this works. They sat in comfortable silence, hands linked, watching the sky turn shades of orange and pink and purple. Gideon? Eleanor said after a while. Yeah? I think I might be pregnant. His hand tightened on hers. You think or you know? Pretty sure. All the signs are there. I wanted to be certain before I said anything, but she looked at him. How do you feel about that? For a long moment, Gideon didn't speak. His face went through a series of expressions too quick to name. Then he smiled. Not an almost smile. A full, genuine, unguarded smile that transformed his entire face. I feel like I'm the luckiest man alive, he said. Eleanor laughed, relief flooding through her. Yeah? Yeah. He pulled her close, kissed her temple. A baby. Our baby. Are you scared? Terrified. But in a good way. He paused. Are you? Also terrified, also in a good way. They held each other while the sun finished setting, while the first stars appeared, while the world shifted once again into something new. Eleanor thought about the woman she'd been 6 months ago. Angry, hopeless, convinced her life was over before it had really begun. That woman wouldn't recognize who Eleanor had become, wouldn't believe that the forced marriage could turn into love, that the mountain could become home, that the man everyone feared could be kind and good and hers. But it had. It was. He was. And now they were building something even bigger than a cabin or a garden or a life. They were building a family. The pregnancy was harder than Eleanor had expected. Not physically, though that was no walk in the park either. She was sick most mornings for the first 3 months, tired all the time, and her back ached from doing exactly nothing. But those were just inconveniences. Bodies did what bodies did. The hard part was the fear. Eleanor had watched her mother die giving birth, had buried the brother she'd never even met. She knew the statistics, knew that childbirth killed women regularly, especially in places like the mountains where help was hours away and complications meant death. She didn't tell Gideon about the fear at first, didn't want to burden him with something he couldn't fix. But he noticed anyway. Of course he did. You're worried, he said one night when she couldn't sleep, lying awake staring at the ceiling. I'm fine. You're a terrible liar. He rolled over to face her. Talk to me. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. Then the words came out in a rush. My mother died having my brother. She was healthy, strong, everything you're supposed to be, and she still died. The baby died. My father never recovered from it. She paused. What if that happens to me? What if I die and leave you alone and our baby doesn't even survive and everything we built just falls apart? Gideon pulled her close, his hand resting on her stomach where nothing showed yet, but everything was changing. That's not going to happen, he said. You don't know that. You're right. I don't. But I know you're not your mother. You're Eleanor Crow. You faced down 9 wolves and 3 armed men in a burning cabin. You're not going to let childbirth beat you. Childbirth doesn't care how brave I am. No, but I do. And so does Doc Hartley, who's going to be here when the time comes, and so do you, which means you're going to prepare for this, like you prepare for everything else, with more planning than any one situation reasonably needs. Despite herself, Eleanor smiled. You think I overplan? I think you make lists for your lists, but it works, so I'm not complaining. They lay in silence for a while. Eleanor felt the fear ease slightly, pushed back by Gideon's certainty, by the warmth of his hand on her stomach, by the knowledge that whatever happened, she wouldn't face it alone. Gideon, she said quietly. Yeah? If something does go wrong, it won't. But if it does, save the baby. Promise me. Whatever choice has to be made, you save the baby. Gideon went very still. Don't ask me to promise that. I need to know. No. His voice was firm, hard. I'm not choosing between you. I'm not losing you. So you're both going to be fine because I can't. He stopped, started again. You're both going to be fine. Eleanor heard the desperation under his words, the fear that matched her own. Okay, she said, we're both going to be fine. She said it like a promise, like saying it out loud could make it true. The next morning, Eleanor started making plans. She talked to Doc Hartley about every possible complication, read every medical text she could find about childbirth, prepared tinctures and herbs for pain, for bleeding, for infection, made lists of supplies they'd need, backup plans if something went wrong, contingencies for the contingencies. Gideon built a cradle from pine wood and carved it with animals, wolves and deer and bears, a whole forest of creatures to watch over their child. He reinforced the bedroom, added more blankets, made sure the fireplace could keep the room warm enough for a newborn in winter. They turned preparation into armor against uncertainty. Word spread through the mountain communities that Eleanor was pregnant. People brought gifts, hand-sewn baby clothes, blankets, a rocking chair that Gideon immediately claimed for himself. Sarah Chen visited regularly, bringing food and company and stories about her own children to make Eleanor laugh. Even people from town showed up occasionally. Mrs. Patterson brought jam and acted like she'd always thought Eleanor was a perfectly respectable woman. Mrs. Chen brought tea and asked if Eleanor needed anything, her previous gossip apparently forgotten. Eleanor accepted it all with grace she didn't entirely feel. People were strange creatures, quick to judge, quick to forget they'd judged once you proved them wrong. But she was learning that grudges took energy she needed elsewhere, so she thanked them for the gifts and let the past stay in the past. 5 months into the pregnancy, on a cold October morning, Eleanor's father showed up. She was in the garden harvesting the last of the vegetables before the first hard freeze. Gideon was in the barn working on repairs. She heard the horse before she saw it, looked up to find Samuel Vale riding toward the cabin. Eleanor's first instinct was to call for Gideon. Her second was to stand her ground. She chose the second. Her father dismounted slowly, like he wasn't sure of his welcome. He looked older than Eleanor remembered. Grayer. More worn. "Eleanor," he said. "Father." An awkward silence stretched between them. "I heard you were expecting," Samuel said finally. "Wanted to see how you were doing." "I'm fine." "Good. That's good." He shifted his weight. "The place looks nice. You and Crow have built something solid here." "We have." More silence. Eleanor waited. She'd learned patience from Gideon, the art of being quiet until the other person revealed what they really wanted. "I came to apologize," Samuel said, "for selling you like livestock, for being so desperate and drunk and useless that I couldn't see any other way out." He met her eyes. "I was a terrible father. I know that. I've known it for a long time. But I was too proud to admit it." Eleanor set down her basket of vegetables. "Why now? Why come all this way to tell me this now?" "Because you're going to be a mother soon, and I didn't want you to make the same mistakes I did." He paused. "I let my grief over your mother poison everything, let it turn me bitter and small, took it out on you when you deserved better. And by the time I realized what I'd done, I didn't know how to fix it. So you sold me to clear your debts. I sold you because I thought at least Crow could give you a life I couldn't. And yeah, it was selfish. It was cowardly. But I also thought maybe you'd be better off away from me." He looked away. Turns out I was right about that. Eleanor didn't know what to say. She'd imagined this conversation 100 times, had practiced all the angry things she'd say, all the ways she'd make him understand how much he'd hurt her. But standing here now, looking at this broken old man who'd lost everything to his own weakness, she found the anger had faded to something closer to pity. "I'm not going to tell you it's okay," Eleanor said, "because it wasn't. What you did hurt me, made me feel worthless for years. I'm still dealing with that." Samuel nodded. "I know. But I also won't say I regret how things turned out, because I don't. Gideon's a good man. This life is good. I'm happy." She paused. "Which I think makes it harder, actually, because I can't even be properly angry at you when your worst decision led to my best outcome. I don't deserve your forgiveness." "Probably not, but I'm not carrying that weight around anymore. It's too heavy, and I need my strength for other things." Eleanor picked up her basket. "You can stay for dinner if you want. Meet your son-in-law properly. See what we've built here." Something like hope flickered across Samuel's face. "I'd like that." Gideon was understandably wary when he came in from the barn to find Samuel Vale sitting at their table drinking coffee. But he was polite, reserved but civil. They ate dinner, venison stew that Eleanor had made that morning, and talked about safe things. The weather, the cabin, the garden. Samuel asked about the pregnancy, about whether they'd thought of names, about their plans. "We're thinking James if it's a boy," Eleanor said. "After Gideon's father. Lily, if it's a girl, after my mother." Samuel's eyes got wet. "She'd like that. Your mother. She'd be proud of you." "I hope so." After dinner, Samuel prepared to leave. He stood on the porch, hat in hand, looking at Eleanor like he was memorizing her. "Thank you for letting me come," he said, "for not turning me away." "You're my father. I can't change that." Eleanor paused. "But I also can't go back to how things were. I don't trust you the way a daughter should trust her father. I don't know if I ever will." "I understand. But maybe we can build something new. Something smaller. Letters, maybe. Visits occasionally. A relationship based on who we are now instead of who we were." Samuel nodded. I'd like that. He rode away into the gathering darkness. Eleanor watched until he disappeared, Gideon's arm around her shoulders. You okay? Gideon asked. Yeah, I think I am. Eleanor leaned into him. I spent so long being angry at him, but anger's exhausting, and I think maybe he suffered enough without me adding to it. That's generous of you. It's practical. I don't have room in my life for grudges anymore. I've got better things to focus on. She put Gideon's hand on her stomach, where the baby was starting to kick, where their future was growing. They stood like that until the cold drove them inside, until the fire needed tending, until real life pulled them back from the edge of forgiveness into the ordinary work of living. Winter came hard that year. Eleanor was 7 months pregnant when the first big storm hit, burying the cabin under 5 feet of snow. She couldn't help with the outdoor work anymore, could barely walk without getting winded, so she focused on inside tasks. Sewing baby clothes, organizing supplies, preparing everything they'd need for the birth. Gideon handled everything else. Clearing paths, tending animals, keeping the cabin warm, making sure Eleanor rested. He was relentless about her health, checking on her constantly, making her eat when she wasn't hungry, forcing her to sleep when she insisted she had work to do. You're being overbearing, Eleanor told him one night. I'm being careful. There's a difference. I'm not fragile. I know. But you're also 8 months pregnant in the middle of winter in the mountains. Let me worry. Eleanor sighed. I don't like being helpless. You're not helpless. You're growing a human. That's the opposite of helpless. He set a cup of tea in front of her. Drink. Doc Hartley said the raspberry leaf helps. When did you become an expert on pregnancy tea? When I started reading all your medical books while you sleep. He sat down across from her. I need to know what's coming. What could go wrong? What to do if it does? Eleanor reached across the table and took his hand. It's going to be okay. You don't know that. No, but I believe it, and sometimes belief is enough. Gideon held her hand tighter. I can't lose you, Eleanor. I know you said we're both going to be fine, and I'm trying to believe that, but if it comes down to a choice, it won't. But if it does, then you'll make whatever choice needs to be made in the moment. Not now, not based on fear. In the moment. Eleanor squeezed his hand. Trust yourself, Gideon. Trust me. We'll get through this. He brought her hand to his lips and kissed it. Okay. Doc Hartley arrived 2 weeks before the baby was due, planning to stay until after the birth. He set up in the patient room, checked Eleanor daily, monitored her health with the thoroughness of someone who understood what was at stake. Everything looks good, he told them after one examination. Baby's positioned right. Eleanor's healthy. All the signs point to a normal delivery. What are the chances something goes wrong? Gideon asked. Doc Hartley hesitated. There's always risk. But Eleanor's strong, she's prepared, and she's got 2 experienced people here to help. That's better than most women get. That's not an answer. Because there isn't a good answer. Birth is unpredictable. Doc Hartley met Gideon's eyes. But I've delivered hundreds of babies, and I'm telling you, I think this one's going to be fine. The baby came on a Tuesday morning in late February, 3 days after a blizzard that buried the world in white silence. Eleanor woke to pain, sharp, rhythmic, unmistakable. She gripped Gideon's arm hard enough to bruise. It's time, she said. What followed was the longest day of Eleanor's life. Labor wasn't like the books described. It wasn't neat or organized or manageable. It was messy and painful and terrifying. Hours of contractions that felt like they'd break her in half. Hours of Doc Hartley checking progress, and Gideon holding her hand and Eleanor trying to remember how to breathe through pain that rewrote her understanding of what the human body could endure. You're doing great, Gideon said for the 100th time, wiping sweat from her forehead. I'm dying, Eleanor gasped. You're not dying, you're just having a baby. Same thing. It's really not. Another contraction hit, and Eleanor stopped being able to form words, just held on to Gideon's hand and tried to survive. Somewhere around hour 14, Doc Hartley said the words she'd been waiting for. You're ready to push. Everything after that was instinct and effort and pain that transcended thought. Eleanor pushed when they told her to push, breathed when they told her to breathe, let her body do what it had been designed to do even though it felt impossible. And then, after one final push that took everything she had left, she heard it.
crying, high-pitched, angry, alive. "It's a boy," Doc Hartley said, holding up a tiny red-faced creature who looked furious at being born. "You have a son." Eleanor fell back against the pillows, exhausted beyond measure. Gideon was crying, actually crying, tears running down his scarred face as Doc Hartley cleaned the baby and wrapped him in a blanket. "Here," Doc Hartley said, placing the baby in Eleanor's arms. "Say hello to your son." Eleanor looked down at the tiny face, at eyes that were trying to focus, at hands that were smaller than anything she'd ever seen, at a whole human being who hadn't existed yesterday and now did. "Hello, James," she whispered. The baby blinked at her, seemed to consider this new world he'd entered, then yawned and fell asleep like birth was exhausting for everyone involved. Gideon sat on the edge of the bed, staring at his son with wonder. "He's so small." "He won't be for long." "Can I hold him?" Eleanor transferred the baby carefully, watched as Gideon cradled his son with hands that had done violence and built cabins and carved wolves, but now held this fragile new life with a gentleness that made her throat tight. "We made this," Gideon said quietly. "We made a whole person. We did. He's perfect. He's asleep. Wait until he's screaming at 2 a.m. Gideon laughed softly. Even then, Doc Hartley finished cleaning up and checked Eleanor one final time. "You did remarkably well. No tearing, no excessive bleeding. You should recover quickly." "See," Eleanor said to Gideon, "I told you we'd be fine." "You did. I'm sorry I doubted you." "You're forgiven. Just this once." They stayed like that for a long time, the three of them in the quiet cabin while snow fell outside and the fire crackled and the world rearranged itself around this new reality. Eleanor had thought she understood love before, had thought what she felt for Gideon was the fullest her heart could get. But looking at her husband holding their son, watching this scared warrior who'd survived war and isolation transform into a father in the space of a heartbeat, she realized love was bigger than she'd imagined, more complicated, more painful, and more perfect all at once. The first few weeks with a newborn were chaos. James was a good baby, or so everyone said, but good was relative when you were functioning on 2 hours of sleep and your entire life revolved around feeding schedules and diaper changes. Eleanor had delivered babies before, but caring for her own was different, harder, more terrifying because the stakes were personal. Gideon was better at it than she'd expected. He'd wake for the middle of the night crying, walk James around the cabin when he was fussy, change diapers without complaint. He sang to the baby, old war songs with the violent verses changed to something softer, lullabies he half remembered from childhood. "Where did you learn that one?" Eleanor asked one night, listening to him hum something haunting and sad. "My mother used to sing it before she died." "It's beautiful. It's probably supposed to be happier, but this is the only version I remember." Eleanor watched him sway with their son, this man who'd seemed so hard when she first met him, now completely undone by a baby who couldn't even hold up his own head yet. "You're a good father," she said. Gideon looked at her, surprise clear on his face. "You think so?" "I know so. I'm terrified I'll do something wrong. Drop him or forget to feed him or welcome to parenthood. That terror doesn't go away." "When does it get easier?" "I'll let you know when I figure it out." But despite the exhaustion and the fear and the complete upheaval of their lives, Eleanor had never been happier. Spring arrived slowly, melting the snow in patches, revealing the garden Eleanor had planted last year. New growth pushed through old soil. The creek ran high with snowmelt. Birds returned to the mountains, filling the morning air with songs. Eleanor was outside with James, now 3 months old and starting to notice the world around him, when she saw riders approaching. Not threatening this time, just 3 people on horseback, moving at an easy pace. Sarah Chen was in front, followed by 2 women Eleanor recognized from the mountain settlements. They dismounted and immediately descended on the baby with the enthusiasm of women who love children. "He's beautiful," Sarah said, cooing at James, who responded by spitting up on her shoulder. "Sorry," Eleanor said. "Please, I've got 3 of my own. This is nothing." Sarah wiped off her shoulder without concern. "We brought food. Figured you could use some meals you didn't have to cook yourself." They'd brought more than meals. There was bread and preserves and a pie that smelled like heaven. There were more baby clothes, blankets, a toy that one of the other women had carved. "You didn't have to do all this," Eleanor said. "Of course we did. That's what people do." Sarah paused. "Well, that's what people should do. I know it wasn't always like that for you in town, but up here we take care of each other." Eleanor felt her throat tighten. "Thank you." They stayed for hours, drinking tea and sharing stories and playing with James. Before they left, Sarah pulled Eleanor aside. "You know, when you first came up here, people had opinions about Crow, about the marriage, about whether you'd survive the winter." She smiled. "You proved them all wrong. Built yourself a good life. And more than that, you became someone people respect. Someone people come to when they need help. I just do what I can." "That's more than most people do, and it matters." Sarah squeezed her hand. "I'm glad you're here, Eleanor. The mountains are better for having you." After they left, Eleanor told Gideon about the conversation. "She's right," he said. "You've changed things up here, made the settlements feel more connected, given people hope that they can survive the winters and the isolation and all the rest of it. I'm just one person. Sometimes one person is enough." That summer, Eleanor started teaching. Women from the mountain communities would come to the cabin for lessons in herbalism and basic medicine. She'd show them how to identify plants, how to prepare remedies, how to treat common ailments without needing to ride half a day to find a doctor. Doc Hartley came regularly to teach alongside her, combining his formal training with her practical knowledge. Together, they created something neither could have built alone. The cabin became a gathering place, a center for the scattered mountain folk who'd previously lived in isolation. People came for medicine and stayed for conversation, for community. Gideon built more furniture to accommodate the visitors, added a porch with benches where people could sit and talk, expanded the barn to house more horses. One evening, after everyone had left and James was asleep in his cradle, Eleanor and Gideon sat on the new porch watching the sunset. "Did you ever imagine this?" Eleanor asked. "When you agreed to marry me?" "Never. I thought I'd be clearing a debt and getting someone to cook dinner, maybe help with chores. And instead? Instead, I got a wife who shoots better than half the men I knew in the war, heals people with plants she grows herself, and turned my isolated cabin into the social center of the mountains." He smiled. "You exceeded expectations." "You weren't so bad yourself. I thought I was marrying a monster. Got a man who builds cradles and sings lullabies and cries when his son smiles. I don't cry that much. You absolutely do." "Maybe a little." They sat in comfortable silence, holding hands, listening to the mountain sounds. "Eleanor," Gideon said after a while. "Yes?" "I want to do something official." "What do you mean?" He turned to face her. "We got married once because your father had debts and I had money, and neither of us had better options. That was business, a transaction." He paused. "I want to marry you again. For real this time. Because I choose you. Because I love you. Because I want everyone to know that this marriage isn't about debt or obligation. It's about us." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. "You want to have another wedding?" "I want to stand up in front of people and marry you properly, the way it should have been from the start." He squeezed her hand. "What do you say?" "I say yes. Obviously yes." They planned the wedding for late summer, when the wildflowers were at their peak and the weather was most reliable. Word spread quickly. People Eleanor had helped, families she'd treated, communities she'd connected, all of them wanted to be there. Sarah Chen insisted on organizing everything. Doc Hartley offered to officiate. The cabin became a hub of activity as preparations took shape. Eleanor made herself a new dress, deep green cotton that actually fit her properly, that showed she wasn't hiding anymore. Gideon bought new clothes for the first time since the war, traded 3 pelts for a jacket that made him look almost civilized. The day of the wedding dawned clear and bright. They decided to hold it in the meadow behind the cabin, where Eleanor's garden grew and wildflowers carpeted the ground. Someone had built an arch from pine branches decorated with mountain bells and columbine. Benches were arranged in rows already filling with people. Eleanor looked out the window and saw what felt like half the mountains in attendance. Ranchers and trappers and miners, families from the settlements, Doc Hartley and Sarah Chen, and people Eleanor had treated over the past year. Even a few folks from Black Hollow Ridge,
including Mrs. Patterson, who'd apparently had a complete change of heart about Eleanor's worthiness. Her father was there too, standing awkwardly at the back, like he wasn't sure he had the right to be present. Eleanor caught his eye and nodded. He nodded back, relief visible even from a distance. "You ready?" Gideon asked, coming up behind her. He was holding James, who was dressed in a tiny version of his father's new clothes. "I'm ready. Are you?" "Been ready since the day you stood between me and those men with nothing but a pistol and nerve." Eleanor took his free hand. "Then let's get married. Again. Properly this time." They walked out together, no formal processional, no giving away or being given. Just two people who'd found each other in unlikely circumstances and built something real from it. Doc Hartley stood under the arch, smiling like a proud father. The crowd quieted as Eleanor and Gideon approached. "We're gathered here today," Doc Hartley began, "to witness something rare. Two people who were thrown together by circumstance choosing each other by design. Eleanor and Gideon got married once before in a courthouse, fulfilling an obligation. Today, they marry again, this time for love." He talked about the journey they'd taken together, about the cabin burning and being rebuilt, about the community they'd created, about love that grew slowly from respect and partnership into something unbreakable. Then it was time for the vows. Gideon went first. "Eleanor, when I agreed to marry you the first time, I thought I was doing a practical thing, solving a problem. But you turned my whole life upside down, made me feel things I'd stopped believing I could feel, made me want things I'd given up on." He paused, his voice rough with emotion. "You see me. Not what I did in the war, not what people say about me, just me. And you love me anyway. I don't know what I did to deserve that, but I promise I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of it. But..." Eleanor's turn. "Gideon, I came to these mountains thinking my life was over, that I was unwanted, worthless, a burden someone was paying to take off their hands. You proved all of that wrong. You treated me like I mattered, like my thoughts and skills and presence had value. You gave me space to become who I was always meant to be." She squeezed his hand. "I love you. Not because I have to, not because we're bound by some paper, but because you're kind and strong and you made me believe I could be those things too. I choose you today and every day after." Doc Hartley smiled. "Then by the power invested in me by these mountains and this community, I declare you married. Again. For real this time." Gideon kissed her while everyone cheered. James, caught between them, made a sound that might have been approval or might have been protest at being squished. Either way, it made everyone laugh. The celebration lasted until sunset. There was food, more than Eleanor had seen in one place since leaving town. Music, courtesy of a rancher who played fiddle. Dancing in the meadow while children ran wild and adults forgot to be serious for a few hours. Eleanor danced with Gideon, with her father, with Doc Hartley, with James, who couldn't dance but seemed to enjoy being bounced around. She talked to everyone who'd come, thanked them for being there, felt the full weight of community in a way she never had before. These people had accepted her, not because of who her father was or who she'd married, but because of who she'd proven herself to be. That mattered more than any revenge against the town that had rejected her ever could. As the sun set and people started heading home, Sarah Chen pulled Eleanor aside one more time. "You know what I love about your story?" Sarah said. "What?" "Everyone thought they knew how it would end. Poor Eleanor Vale, sold to the mountain man, probably dead within a year. But you rewrote the ending, turned tragedy into triumph, made something beautiful out of something that should have destroyed you." Eleanor looked over at Gideon, who was holding James and talking to Doc Hartley. His face relaxed in a way it never was when they first met. "I had help," she said. "Maybe. But you were the one brave enough to accept it, to believe you deserved better than what you'd been given." Sarah hugged her. "That's the real strength. Not just surviving, but deciding you're worth more than survival." After everyone left and the meadow was quiet again, Eleanor and Gideon stood together watching the first stars appear. "What are you thinking about?" Gideon asked. "About how far we've come. About how different everything is from that first day when you brought me here and I thought my life was ending. And now? Now I think it was just beginning. I just didn't know it yet." Gideon shifted James to one arm and pulled Eleanor close with the other.
Best decision I ever made, marrying you. First time or second time? Both. All the times. Every time. They stood there in the gathering darkness, a family now, rooted to this mountain that had seemed so hostile and was now home. Eleanor thought about the woman she'd been a year and a half ago. That woman wouldn't recognize her now, wouldn't believe that the forced marriage could become this, that the unwanted daughter could become someone people sought out, that isolation could transform into community. But that was the thing about life. It surprised you, took you places you never expected to go, turned you into people you never thought you could be. The town had called her worthless, unmarriageable, a burden, but the town was wrong. Eleanor Crow was a healer, a teacher, a wife and mother and friend. She was strong and smart and valuable in ways that had nothing to do with being pretty or pleasant or small. And she'd built a life worth living in a place that had tried to break her. That was revenge enough. That was better than revenge. That was victory. Years later, when James was old enough to understand stories, Eleanor would tell him about how she and his father met, about the forced marriage and the burning cabin and the wolves, and the choice to stay when leaving would have been easier. "Why did you stay?" James would ask. "If you were so scared." And Eleanor would smile and say, "Because sometimes the things that scare us most are exactly the things we need. Sometimes the life we think we want isn't the life that will make us happy. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, we find people who see us for who we really are and love us not despite our flaws, but because of them." "That's complicated," James would say. "Love usually is," Eleanor would agree, "but it's worth it. Every complicated, difficult, beautiful piece of it." And looking at Gideon across the room where he was teaching their son to carve, at the cabin they'd built together, at the life they'd made from nothing but determination and hope and the courage to believe they deserved something better, Eleanor knew it was true. Love was complicated, but it was worth it, every single time.